Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 270. This week it is of course the Patreon Drydock because it's the end of the month, so let's get on with the extensive list of questions that have been submitted this month. Sam Signorelli asks, during the development of ships, at what point when you're working on improving a given ship class, do you declare the new designs to be a new class? Something like going from a smallish straight-deck carrier to a larger one with an angled flight deck is obvious, but what about vessels where the changes appear to be minimal to the untrained eye? What made, for example, the Sumners a different class from the Fletchers? Now, as I covered in a recent Drydock, whether or not you define something as a new class or a new subclass does vary somewhat by nation. By some definitions, like the ones I would use, for example, you could argue that the Hipper class is not actually a class, it's a related family of separate cruisers, but other people call it the Hipper class, and, you know, you can have arguments one way or the other, but nonetheless, generally speaking, the system that's used most of the time by most navies, and which I would sort of stick to as well, is that when you're considering a ship's capabilities, you normally look at speed, protection, and firepower as your basic starters. And in terms of defining class, I would just slightly refine that to propulsion, hull, and armament. There is a subtle difference there, which you'll see in a minute. And essentially, those three components, you know, your propulsion units, your weapons systems, and that includes things like your magazines and fire control systems, and your hull, its dimensions, displacement, etc., and if present, any armor protection, those are kind of the characteristics that define whether or not this ship is the same as this other ship, or almost the same as this other ship, or different enough to be a subclass, or different enough to be an entirely new class. And with, say, the Admiral Hippers, the armament, broadly speaking, at least for the main battery, doesn't change, and the propulsion system mostly stays the same. So that's your, you know, number of shafts, number of rudders, power plant, etc. The hull changes, and, you know, some people, as I will say, okay, well, just that one change, you know, each ship getting slightly larger and displacing slightly more doesn't make enough to be a big difference. And okay, maybe to a certain extent you could accept that. And I have to point out at this stage that wartime modifications and modernizations don't really count, because you're changing something that was already there, as opposed to with subclasses and classes, that's generally for new build vessels. So if you look at something like Warspite, Renown, Conte de Cavour, Texas, etc., all of those ships are radically different from what they were before, and in some cases, especially with Renown and Repulse, and then QE and Valiant, compared to Warspite, compared to Barham and Malaya, the capabilities of ships between the classes as a result of modernizations and upgrades are actually radically different. But it would be incorrect to say that, you know, QE and Valiant form their own subclass, Warspite forms its own subclass, and Barham and Malaya form their own subclass just because they're modernized. But what all this is getting around to is that if you make a substantial change to one of those three broad systems, propulsion, hull, and armament, or you make somewhat less substantial changes to more than one of those features, it's highly arguable that you have come up with a new class of vessel. So if you compare the Sumners to the Fletchers, whilst they have the same power output, the same power plant, and they started off, obviously, the Sumners as a modification of the Fletchers, and so they're the same length, in terms of their propulsion systems, the Summoners have 2 rudders versus the Fletchers 1, so that's a change in the overall propulsion setup. The Summoners are slightly beamier. They start off about 2 foot beamier than a Fletcher, and it varies very slightly depending on which summoner you're looking at. Some are very slightly wider than that, some are only a foot wider than the Fletchers. And of course, the most obvious visual difference, the armament. You've gone from 5 single 5-inch 38s to 6 in twin mounts, as you can see here. And obviously, there's other differences in the armament layout as well when you look at its torpedo loadout, its light anti-aircraft loadout, sensors, etc., etc. And that makes them a separate class. And in much the same way, when you look at the Orion, King George V and Iron Duke class battleships that the Royal Navy built, if you look at them from a distance and look at their headline statistic, obviously their main battery is battleships, you might think, well, why are they 3 separate classes? They look vaguely similar. They all have 10, 13.5-inch guns in 5 twin turrets laid out in pretty much the same layout. And yes, all that is true. And in the case of the first 2 classes, they actually have the same output of power plant. But when you look at the hull size, and then you look at things like the secondary battery, the armor layout, etc., and in the case of the Iron Duke, the power output, you start to see fairly substantial differences between each class. But as I alluded to earlier and in the previous Drydock, what exactly constitutes substantial changes can vary somewhat from navy to navy. Daniel asks, if naval codes were changed whilst a ship was underway, how would the ship's captain know what the new codes to use were? For example, B-Dienst gave German intelligence valuable information until the Allies learned this and changed their ciphers in 1942. How would ships or bases far from any homeland port know to read the new Allied code? Naval Command can't broadcast on the old broken code what the new secure one is. That's a very good question, and this is one of the reasons why most navies maintained more than one cipher. Because, unfortunately, if someone has broken your code, if you're at least in a navy in the terms of the scale of World War II, World War I, something like that, it's not really just as simple as broadcasting, okay, we're going to go to a new code. Because, obviously, as you mentioned, that would be hilariously insecure. So, unless you're absolutely convinced that your system of encryption is completely unbreakable, hence the picture, normally you would have a variety of different naval ciphers, and these would usually be used for different levels of sensitivity of information. So, if one of them is compromised, you can just tell everyone, okay, well, we're not using this code for the minute, and send everything in this other code, which would be either considered slightly more or less secure in the hierarchy, but as far as you know, hasn't been compromised by the enemy. So that would be a temporary stopgap solution. But the broader need would obviously be to replace that system of ciphers, and that takes time, because you've got to come up with a new one, or maybe you've come up with a bunch in this kind of eventuality, either way, but you've now got to print all the copies of that to distribute to all the ships that are going to need to use it, and to avoid the confusion of people using old codes and new codes, you can't immediately switch. As I said, you can switch to another cipher if you have multiple ciphers within your fleet, but for that particular one, there's not going to be an immediate successor. What will happen is you'll set a date, and you'll say to everyone, okay, on this date, we will switch from using this cipher, which we believe has been compromised, to this other cipher. And that date will be far enough ahead in the future that within reason, pretty much everybody who could be affected by that will have managed to, at some point, reach port, receive a copy of the new cipher, and then everyone will be sitting there going, okay, do not use this cipher until 25th of August 1941, and then on the 25th you start using your new cipher. The corollary to that, of course, is if you wanted to be really clever but also possibly have additional security risks, you could have ships carry multiple copies. So if you had, let's say you had Naval Cipher number 2, and you might have 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, just arbitrarily using designations, and 2A is for your really secret stuff, and 2D is for your kind of back and forth day-to-day chatter that you just don't want to be necessarily directly overheard by a U-boat or something. And someone says, well, 2C has been compromised. Now, as I said, if you wanted to run the risk, you could potentially have ships go out with books having Naval Cipher 2 in its variant and Naval Cipher 3, its proposed successor, in its variants. And they may or may not be more or less secure. They're just different because it resets enemies' ability to try and decode what you're saying. And then you could send out, okay, everybody, as far as we know, 2C has been compromised. Continue using 2A, 2B, and 2D. But if you will please kindly open your books for Naval Cipher number 3 and look at 3C for Grade C communications, this is what we're going to use. That's a possible way to do it, for the obvious reason that if somebody captures one of your ships, they will have your current and future ciphers aboard. It wasn't really done in 99.9% of all cases. So usually it would just be a case of switch to another cipher temporarily and then have a broad update later on, kind of like the way they patch code these days. Andrew Dederer asks, while sails and rigging didn't go away until somewhere around the 1880s, it seems that by the Crimean War, no ship was attempting to fight under sail if it had an engine. Kearsarge versus Alabama looks like an old-fashioned wooden wall fight, except neither had an inch of canvas up. How did this freedom of action change battle tactics, as the weather gauge seems mostly irrelevant? And also, what changed now that battle could be joined in under an hour compared to the approach at Trafalgar, etc., which took the better part of a day? In terms of approach to battle, you gradually started to see a reduction in the amount of work that needed to be done to clear a ship for action. Because, as you say, during the Age of Sail, outside of some very, very rare events, if you spotted an enemy fleet closing in on you, you at least had a few hours before the shooting started in earnest, at which point dismantling entire mess tables and, breaking down the captain's furniture, removing paneling, taking out glass windows, etc., could all be done because you had hours to do it and hundreds of men to employ doing that work. Whereas once the Age of Steam comes about and there's now a kind of a minimum floor, at which point it's like you will be in action in at least this time or possibly less, then you don't have the time to do quite as much as all that, which means now either your really vulnerable stuff has to be permanently stored below the waterline, or you just don't have it, or you come up with, interesting and innovative ways of making sure that this stuff can be very rapidly broken down and moved. In terms of battle tactics, whilst the weather gauge was less relevant, it did still have some bearing, because you've got to remember that if you are sailing broadside to the wind, that's generally speaking going to be a roughly broadside to the waves as well, which is going to induce quite a bit of rolling. And even if you're not sailing completely broadside to the wind, if one side has the weather gauge and the other doesn't, since the ships still have masts and rigging, even if they haven't deployed their sails and they still physically have sides, there is still going to be a degree of sort of semi-permanent list imparted to the two ships, which may affect exactly what range of motion their guns have. It's also going to affect how much and what parts of the ship are exposed to gunfire at the extreme ends. So if you have the weather gauge, for example, you will be leaning towards your opponent slightly, which means it's more likely that hits will come in on your deck. And your belt, especially once you get to the late 1870s and 1880s, when the belts start to become shorter and shorter in terms of vertical height, may be completely submerged. Whereas the other way, if you're in the lee, then your deck's almost certainly not going to get hit because it's going to be rolled away from your opponent, but an underwater portion of your hull might be exposed. So the weather gauge, whilst in and of itself in terms of a manoeuvrability issue doesn't become so much of a problem, at least while ships are retaining significant amounts of sail and so forth, as I said, in terms of mast and rigging, even if they're not deploying the sail, it could be an issue. So you might seek to just avoid being in that situation entirely because of advantages and disadvantages on both sides. Now, of course, we do have the problem of there not being that many large-scale fleet versus fleet actions during that particular time period, so we can more accurately see the effect on single ship tactics. And on single ship tactics, well, even in the Age of Sail, single vessel versus single vessel, or 2 or 3 versus 2 or 3, was very often a wheeling melee trying to gain advantage, and steam just allowed you to do that with a little less doldrums and a little less stalling out. So it gave you a bit more tactical flexibility, because if you're in, say, a frigate versus frigate action, you might, in theory, in terms of geometry, look at a situation and go, yeah, well, I can hook around the bow of this other frigate and rake it. But in so doing, you might have to turn head on to the wind, which is going to make you becalmed, which will actually mean that you don't do that, and the other frigate will sail past you and actually rake you instead. Whereas with steam, if that's the geometrically and tactically better tactic, you can just do it. Of course, if somebody then hits your engines and you don't have any sails deployed, as happened with Alabama, you're pretty much dead in the water and dead to rights. But with fleet actions, in theory, it didn't make a huge difference, because ships were still relatively unarmed and relatively vulnerable at the bow and the stern. Not as vulnerable as they had been in the Age of Sail, but still more for the lack of firepower than anything else. So most fleet tactics still looked at sailing in a battle line, but with more freedom of where to place that battle line and, try to outspeed, outmaneuver the enemy. Of course, this assumed that everybody was broadly equal, the way that it had been in the Age of Sail, where, everybody's third rates were, broadly speaking, in the same ballpark, and so on and so forth. But when individual ship capabilities and overall fleet sizes could be radically different in the Age of Steam, Steam also gave you the capacity to take on some rather new and interesting tactics, like, for example, Admiral Tegethoff at the Battle of Lissa, where he just took his entire fleet and body-slammed the Italian fleet, which had formed a somewhat more conventional line of battle. 22NF2 asks, in your rum rations on the design history of the Yamato class, you said that one of the proposed iterations would have carried 12 aircraft. This got me curious. In the event of an attack from the air by fighters as well as torpedo and dive bombers, what was the Japanese doctrine or strategy in the use of its complement of, presumably, spotter aircraft in such an instance? Would they be launched to assist the ship with anti-air defense, or were they used in some other way? Generally speaking, doctrine for the Japanese, and also for almost everybody else, with spotter aircraft was just to keep them safe, below decks, in hangars, whatever applied, for a number of reasons. Firstly, that because they're spotter aircraft, they obviously tend to carry rather large floats because they have to land again on the water. This compromises their performance to the point that if the Japanese were, say, looking at the types of aircraft carried on a Yamato-class battleship, they would have noted that the maximum performance characteristics of the spotter aircraft, in terms of, say, speed and rate of climb, etc., are broadly speaking similar to the performance characteristics of a B-5N torpedo bomber. And some of the spotter aircraft didn't even carry any forward-facing guns. Some of them did, other models didn't. They would just carry a rear gunner. And even in the ones that did have forward-facing guns, which is, they're spotter aircraft, they're not supposed to be heavily armed, so they're not carrying huge numbers of guns either, which means there's a decent chance that if you, say, engage a Dauntless, the spotter aircraft would actually be outgunned. Plus, specifically in the case of the Dauntless is also just flat out faster. And of course, the enemy air attack is coming in from altitude, even if the torpedo bombers are descending, which means that your aircraft, which you're going to have to be launching 1 or 2 at a time, depending on how many catapults you've got, are going to have to be climbing up towards them. And given the speed of aircraft in the late 30s and early 40s, that means you're essentially going to be meeting them halfway into their attack runs. And that leads to another problem, which is obviously your ship's anti-aircraft gunners are going to want to go full hog on defending the ship. If you've got your own scout aircraft, which, as we just noted, are actually some of the lower performing aircraft out there, and therefore somewhat easier targets. In the heat of the moment, it's entirely possible you might have your own scout aircraft blown out of the sky by your own guns, or you unnecessarily cripple your ability to respond by telling your gunners, no, you have to absolutely make sure that that's not one of our own aircraft before you shoot at it. And the rather larger issue of the fact that if your scout aircraft have the performance similar to a torpedo bomber, then yeah, they're going to be fairly easy meat for any escorting enemy fighters that have shown up. So it's a good way of hampering your own anti-air defense and losing a bunch of your own aircraft, as opposed to just not launching them. Now, that isn't to say that more capable recon aircraft, including recon aircraft derived from actual fighter designs, didn't come along later on, but of course fighter designs were evolving, and by the time you start to see some navies, especially the Japanese, occasionally the Italians, deploying much more high-performance recon aircraft on their ships, it's essentially pointless to try, because whilst, okay, a dozen roughly fighter-grade, even if low-end fighter-grade recon aircraft might have been a useful protection for a ship in 1940, 1941, maybe even 1942, when your strike packages are, single-digit or teens numbers of aircraft arriving at any given time. By the time the better performing scout aircraft are in service, even assuming they have forward-facing armament, which a lot of the high-speed ones don't actually have, but even if they did, you'd be looking at strike packages that are coming in which have dozens upon dozens of aircraft, at which point you go back to the problem we described earlier. Greb asks, HMS Warrior versus any first-rate. I'm assuming independence from the wind and the ability to mount heavier guns that can outrange all the first-rate guns would mean Warrior would win the fight, but could Warrior absorb a full first-rate broadside if it was unfortunate to get that close? And what's the likely damage with her broadside to the first-rate in return, assuming similarly trained crew and favourable weather conditions? Well, a lot of it is going to depend on the first rate in question, because if you go back to, say, a Trafalgar grade first rate like HMS Victory, or even Santissima Trinidad, solid shot 32-pounder cannon, or 36-pounder cannon if you're going with a French gun or something like that, they are fundamentally incapable of penetrating Warrior's armour even at point-blank range. Now, of course, Warrior has an armoured Citadel box, so if a first-rate and Warrior were sailing alongside each other, let's use Santissima Trinidad, for example, because it's quite tall as well, I wouldn't want to be on Warrior's upper decks. Now, they're almost as vulnerable as anyone else is. Okay, built up a little bit more substantially than first rates, but the heavy gunfire at point blank range, even from 1805 era cannon, isn't going to have too much of a problem poking holes in there. And similarly, the bow and the stern could be riddled, at least by the heavier guns. But the whole point of Warrior is that she's designed to be able to withstand exactly that kind of punishment without any material effect to her combat capability. So, yeah, she could absorb that. And then she'd return fire, and the return fire effect would be massively, massively more devastating, even if she doesn't use some of the fancier stuff like the molten iron-filled Martin shell. She has very large guns compared, 68-pounders, etc., compared to, and the 110-pounders compared to the guns of the first rate, and they are capable of being loaded with explosive shells, as well as the Martin shell, as well as the solid shot. So a broadside, even though from a smaller number of guns from Warrior, would cause carnage on the deck of a first rate if it got that salvo off. You'd probably be talking multiple fires, dozens if not hundreds of casualties, and a significant reduction in the first rate's combat capability in a single salvo. Now, of course, things get slightly more interesting if you're going up against a first rate that was built in the 1840s or the 1850s, because they are substantially larger vessels than the ones from 1805, and they carry a slightly different mix of weapons. So whilst the 32-pounder is still present, A good chunk of the Royal Navy's first rates, for example, were carrying substantial batteries of 8-inch shell-firing guns. Now, those shell-firing guns, obviously being somewhat larger and firing explosive shells, will make a considerably larger mess of the unprotected areas of Warrior, similar to what I described earlier, but just on a bigger scale. But, of course, they are what you might call in a later era essentially HE only firing guns. So again, they can't penetrate Warrior's citadel, and Warrior will do huge amounts of damage in return. It'll just take slightly longer because there's more first rate to absorb the punishment this time round. Now, of course, there is a subset between the advent of the ironclad and the final hurrah of the first-rate ship of the line, which is a relatively brief period, but nonetheless, during that period, some first-rates were rearmed, at least partially, with similar guns to those that were being equipped on the ironclads, and of course there was a bit of a back-and-forth race in the ironclads as to who could build an ironclad that carried heavier guns that could penetrate the other ironclad's armour, then someone else would build an ironclad with even heavier armour, and so on and so forth. So towards the very, very end of the period, if you got kind of a very late stage ironclad like, say, SMS Kaiser, and of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, that is, and you put it up against a very early, maybe budget ironclad, then potentially at that point the first rate would be able to penetrate the small ironclad's armour, at which point the sheer number of guns it carries, considering now they're both vulnerable to each other's weapons, would give it an advantage, but that's a very niche scenario. Matt Blom asks, on a live stream recently, I believe Travis from Battleship Texas mentioned ship's blueprints note where to place keel blocks in a drydock. Is this true to your knowledge? Would there be any way for a drydock crew to be able to know where to place keel blocks if no blueprints or instructions for a particular ship are available? Yep, it's completely true. Obviously, Travis has access to Texas's blueprints. I actually saw said blueprints when I was aboard USS Texas, which was the day I took this particular photo as well. And it's a very important part of ship design in this time period, because, of course, if you put your drydock keel blocks in the wrong place, and say that block is just resting on hull plating, it's very possible you're just going to punch a keel block shaped hole in the hull, which is not going to make you very popular. Now, of course, a lot of ships, although not all, would have docking keels fitted, which makes life a little bit easier, because then you can run the blocks along the main keel and then along the docking keels, which are, as the name suggests, 2 additional keels placed along the ship to assist with placing it in dry dock. On ships that have bilge keels, they're very often nearby, but you definitely don't want to confuse the two, because a bilge keel will not support the load, usually. Now, it would be a very rare circumstance for a ship to come into dock and the dry dock not have a copy of the blueprints available, simply because those kinds of blueprints would be carried aboard the ship for damage control purposes. So they would just bring them out and go, well, here, 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 and here. Of course, in the event of catastrophic damage, you could argue that perhaps those instructions or blueprints would be destroyed by fire or something. Personally, I'd argue if you get to the point where all your damage control stations have been burnt out by fire and all of your blueprints have been lost, the chances of your ship actually making it back to dry dock are slim to none anyway, but, weird things can happen. In those events, you have a number of potential options. Obviously, if the ship in question has docking keels as well as a main keel, there's a certain amount of load-bearing capacity on those compared to just the hull plating. But ideally, you obviously also want to have them centered on frames. And in that case, I can think of 2 relatively quick and easy methods to work out what's going on. One would be just to send people aboard the ship and physically either measure or look at the various markings that are already in place on the ship and work out where the frames are in relation to the exterior of the ship. You can then measure along the exterior of the ship and you go, okay, well, internally we know that, let's say, frame 112 is 250 feet, again, using completely arbitrary figures, back from the bow. So if we now take a very long rope and go, okay, well, here's the bow on the outside of the ship, 250 foot back, right, here is this is where the frame is, so we'll put the block under here. Now, obviously, you wouldn't actually do that. You'd go to the nearest frame possible for putting down a block, put that block down, and then you'd go, okay, it's X number of feet, 10, 6, 5, whatever feet back from there, and so on and so forth. Or if you were really, really desperate, like the ship needs to be in the dry dock right this instant, worst case scenario, I suppose you could send somebody or multiple crew down with hammers and so forth in the bottom of the ship's hull and just have them stand next to frames or over frames and hit the hull, and you could have someone listening as the water level gradually drops going, right, the sound's coming from roughly there, guys, I guess that's where we're putting the blocks. Wouldn't like to be the one who had to do that, though, because normally the blocks go in before the ship, not whilst the ship is being settled. Ash the Lego guy asks, the French, Dutch and even British tried broadside tubes and even rotating turrets for their submarines torpedoes, whilst other nations tended to stick to bow or bow and stern only. Were these broadside or rotating tubes ever particularly effective, or was it a matter of not being effective enough to justify additional complications, reloading efforts and more penetrations of the pressure hull? A lot of the time you'll find that these non-bow, non-stern torpedo tubes were mounted because the submarine in question was going to be quite large. K-class, X1, Surcouf, that kind of size. At which point people realise these things are not the world's most manoeuvrable objects, and therefore they might come across a target that they either wish to engage because it's just an available target, or they may wish to engage very sharpish because it may be, let's say, an anti-submarine destroyer coming their way, but to bring the ship about either would require too much time or would put them out of position for something else they're trying to do. So let's say they're trying to sneak up on a particularly juicy section of a convoy, they're lining up their bow torpedo tubes, but then they notice an oblivious escort or another really juicy target off to their port bow, for example. And in those cases, theoretically, having the ability to fire essentially off-axis torpedoes, especially with the rotating mounts, or with a K-class broadside, but you can obviously use the gyros to try and adjust the angle of the torpedo once launched, it makes a certain degree of sense. However, that relies on the idea that you've got a big enough sub to support these, because if you've got the torpedoes launch at these additional torpedo launchers on board, as you said, that might be additional penetration of the pressure hull, more space taken up. That's quite a big sacrifice to make for what could be a very niche scenario, and that's why a lot of them tend to be actually outside the pressure hull. So, for example, on Surcouf here, you can see some of the hatching for one of its rotating torpedo launchers, but you'll notice that this is in the upper casing. This is actually above the pressure hull. Now, that does come with a compromise. Of course, it's impossible to reload these torpedoes tubes normally because the reloading takes place inside the pressure hull, unless you want to be on the surface and unless you want to have additional torpedoes strapped outside your hull on the casing, which would be a bit interesting. But I suppose in theory you could do that. So it's generally a lot of time and expense for something to cover a weakness in a large submarine's design that's probably going to be a relatively niche scenario even so, and in the event that that niche scenario comes up, you're probably only going to get one or two shots out of it. So in terms of covering all your bases, which you might as well do if you're building a really big, really expensive cruiser sub or similar, it's probably worth doing. But if you're building a slightly more sane-sized submarine, or a submarine that doesn't have the turning block of the turning radius of a small country, then it's not necessary. And the only other major time you see that kind of thing pop up is with, say, something like the T-class, which have 6 internal and 4 external tubes, 2 at the bow and 2 on the conning tower, or just next to it, to be more accurate. And again, these are external, so they don't require any penetrations of the pressure hull, but as a result, they're one shot. But that's built on a series of fairly major assumptions the British made when designing the T-class, The two biggest ones being that the treaty system at the time that their initial concept was designed outlawed unrestricted submarine warfare. So the British assumed that most of the time submarines would be going after warships. Warships move faster than convoys, and so you're probably only going to get a single attack run. And combined with that, the British had developed ASDIC, what we now know as sonar, so they assumed that everybody else would develop their own version, and as such, that even more so meant that you probably only get one shot at a column of warships, and you might have to make that shot from quite far away to avoid hitting the ASDIC or sonar-equipped screening ships, at which point you just needed to shotgun as many torpedoes downrange as humanly possible and get away. You could have a 10-torpedo salvo, which is what they reckoned they would need to do so, but that would either require doing something similar to what the Italians did with one of their subs, which is use much smaller torpedoes, which if you're going after warships with anti-torpedo defences is not a good idea. The Italian idea was to go after merchant vessels, so they didn't. That wasn't a problem with the Italian design, it was just a different design philosophy for a different set of targets. But the other way you could do it, of course, would be to have a really big submarine, which had a pressure hull big enough to fit 10 torpedo tubes up forward. But they didn't want to do that for partly cost reasons and partly because, well, a submarine that large would be a very tempting target for warships because it, like a cruiser sub, wouldn't be the world's most agile vessel. So the compromise was to build a large-ish submarine with 6 internal tubes and then stick on 4 external tubes, which gave you a one-shot 10-torpedo salvo and done. So essentially these systems are designed in response to very specific problems outside of the normal refit of a submarine. And when either those problems don't exist because you have a smaller, more agile sub, or a different target profile, or you just conclude that, hey, 6 torpedoes is probably enough, if, say, you've got a torpedo data computer or something, then those, the pressing need for external and rotating torpedo launchers go away, and they're not installed. Jim Smitty asks, what was causing the health issues of British admirals in the 1930s? I understand most were working to get the Royal Navy ready for a war they saw coming, but every time I look at the Royal Navy in the 30s, their admirals are dropping like flies or having to retire for health reasons. So what gives? Why did their health go that far downhill that quickly? A combination of reasons. For one thing, their working environment generally wasn't the healthiest, bearing in mind this was the time when smoking a lot was very, very popular. So you're talking about, not just somebody who smokes a few packs a day. You're talking about people who are going through half a dozen to a dozen packs of cigarettes a day in an enclosed environment without a huge amount of ventilation, especially when you're in offices like the higher admirals tended to be. And that's not one person. You're talking about dozens upon dozens of people. And the more and more stress people go under, the more and more they tend to smoke. So, massive carcinogenic clouds floating around, both from cigarettes and pipes. But I think the larger issue is what they were facing. From the mid-30s onwards, it was incredibly clear to everyone in the Royal Navy that a major war was coming, and it was equally clear to them that thanks to the budget cuts of the past 15 to 20 years, they were not ready. And they were frantically trying to get ready. You get a small hint of this when you read Admiral Cunningham's autobiography, which we covered in the last video we did on Admiral Cunningham, which covered the interwar period. Now, he was, to a large extent, spared from that because a lot of the 1930s he had overseas commands, but for the short period that he was back in the UK towards the end of the 1930s, he got an idea of just how intense an environment the admirals were having to work in. And so you've got, an unhealthy working environment in terms of literally the air you're breathing, combined with the fact you're now working exceptionally long hours under immense amounts of stress, trying to not quite rebuild the Royal Navy, but completely reinvigorate and restore it to be ready for a war that is coming. And factored on top of that is going to be the additional legacy stress of the fact that if anyone who's reached flag rank in the 1930s is going to have served in World War I, and they're going to know exactly what that was like, on the nation. So, they've got that, this kind of thing could potentially happen again stress on them, not just we're probably going to be at war. And because of that, they're working even longer hours with less time for rest, less time for relaxation, less time for not being in a toxic cloud of fumes. And when they start to develop minor medical issues, less time to go and have those looked at, to have things, caught early. All of which adds up to, unsurprisingly, between the stress of the situation and everything else, a bunch of them just flat out dropping dead. And as you say, it was a really significant problem. This is Admiral Backhouse, who Admiral Cunningham reckons would have made a brilliant first Sea Lord for World War II. He died in office, and Admiral William Fisher, who would probably have been in charge instead of Backhouse, also died in office, or shortly thereafter, in the late 30s, and several other admirals had also either died in office or within weeks of retiring for health reasons. And of course, Backhouse's successor, Dudley Pound, would die in office during the war with an undiagnosed brain tumour. And this wasn't an issue that was entirely limited to British admirals either. I mean, this focal point of the late 30s really did in for a lot of them. And as Admiral Cunningham himself notes in his autobiography, both Backhouse and Fisher would have made superb fighting admirals for the war had they survived. But the sheer stress of preparing for war, or indeed leading continuously throughout war, can just take you down, either just through sheer stress causing heart attacks and stuff, or through the stress and the hours, etc., contributing or exacerbating other health conditions, or even causing them. Both Admirals Lee and Mitchell of the US Navy both died relatively prematurely, either right at the end of or shortly after the end of World War II, in circumstances that are almost certainly directly related to the amount of pressure they were under during their operational careers during the war. Towboat asks, I more or less understand the size progression of battleship main guns, but why the proliferation of shell sizes between 4 and 6 inches? Are the differences really enough to offset the logistics and manufacturing headaches? This problem starts out in World War I and gets worse and worse as you go through the interwar period and then into World War II. Some navies are more affected by it than others. The Royal Navy is usually brought up as an example of some of the worst affected because they have 4-inch guns, 4.5-inch guns, 4.7-inch guns, 5.25-inch guns, until they're taken off of hood, 5.5-inch guns, and 6-inch guns. And some guns within the same calibers are not actually interoperable with each other in terms of ammunition and so forth. But, the US goes from 4-inch to 5-inch to 6-inch in designs, at least, back to 5-inch, and they've got 6-inch on their light cruisers, and so you have 5-inch 25, 5-inch 51, 5-inch 38, etc. And onward we go. Essentially, the reason for this is, to a certain extent, you could say perfect is the enemy of good enough, which is actually largely accurate, but fundamentally the issue was that when it came to a secondary battery, when you were looking at, even if it was just an anti-surface gun, let alone a dual-purpose gun or an anti-aircraft gun, you wanted a gun that could fire relatively rapidly. Now, to fire relatively rapidly, you had to be able to load the thing quickly. And the vast majority of these guns are hand-loaded, or if they have power assistance, it's relatively minimal, maybe a power ram or something like that. But essentially there's going to be a lot of human handling of shells and potentially shells and charges. And that means there is a limit to the weight that a human can easily and quickly carry and manipulate. And there's also how quickly can you load the thing. Loading one item is much quicker than having to put together 2 items and then load them. So all of this makes what they call fixed ammunition, where the shell and the propellant all come as one unit, kind of like basically a gigantic bullet, essentially. that you fire from a handgun or a rifle. But because you're combining the charge and the shell, that means they have to be relatively small caliber, and that means something like a 4-inch gun. The problem is, at the same time, you want the shells to go a fairly long distance, because hitting an enemy far away is good. You don't want them to get too close, because they might launch torpedoes. And once you do hit them, which is going to be questionable, because of course it's a secondary battery, for a lot of this period you probably don't have direct firing for it, and the enemy is small and fast and highly maneuverable. So when you do land the occasional hit, you want that hit to be as devastating as possible, because that might be the only one you get before they get in torpedo launch range. That means you want a bigger shell. So maybe now you're thinking, we want the 6-inch gun, actually. The problem, of course, being that a 6-inch fixed-piece ammunition, you're not going to get anybody to be able to maneuver. So now you have to make it 2-part ammunition. That slows down your rate of fire, and the 6-inch shell and the 6-inch charges are not, they're still fairly heavy. They've just gone to just about handleable instead of completely unhandleable. So your rate of fire drops. And things only get worse once you start to get into dual-purpose and anti-aircraft guns, because now you've got to factor in also how heavy can the gun itself be, how quickly can we slew it. Now, does that mean we have a shorter barrel, larger caliber weapon, or a longer barrel, smaller caliber weapon? And obviously those are also going to affect characters, because a shorter barrel, high caliber weapon will hit hard but not go quite as far or quite as fast. A long barrel, high caliber weapon will go somewhat further than the rest of its similar caliber brethren. But again, won't hit as quite as much, and the long barrel might still make the gun weigh quite a bit and take up a bit of space, which might not be optimal. And so everyone's playing around trying to find an ideal caliber, because ideally what everybody wants is something that they can make into a long barrel weapon, so it can shoot a long way, with a fairly decent explosive charge, so that when it hits something, it's going to do a substantial amount of damage, but also the actual shells and charges, or combined shell and charge, has to be light enough to be A, manhandleable at all, and B, manhandleable at a fairly rapid rate. And exactly what you place the highest value on, whether it's rate of fire, space, rate of rotation, distance that you fire, explosive warhead, etc., that changes depending on the use case of the gun, because whilst having a common gun is great, and 5-inch 38 is a good example of that, there are slightly different priorities for a destroyer main armament as compared to a battleship secondary armament, as compared to a dedicated anti-aircraft gun. And so at some point, some navies, they keep pursuing the perfect gun for each use case, and sometimes eventually they sit there and go, actually, you know what, it's not ideal in every single circumstance, but it's better to have a universal weapon than keep going down all these various rabbit holes. Now, when that point hits in various navies varies on time. For the US, they were lucky enough to luck into the 5-inch 38, which did have its disadvantages. It didn't hit as hard as a 6-inch gun. Being a 38 caliber weapon, it didn't range as far as a 45, a 47, or a 50 caliber weapon. And in the event you lost your remote power training, a single or a twin 5-inch mount was going to be quite difficult to maneuver compared to, say, a 4-inch mount. But it had a whole list of other advantages, which I've enumerated in more detail in my 5-inch 38 caliber gun video. And so, on balance, the US just went, okay, everybody gets those. Fantastic. For the Royal Navy, it took a bit longer, and they eventually settled on the 4.5-inch gun for similar reasons, but obviously with slightly different priorities. But it takes a while, depending on the Navy, for them to figure this out. John M. asks, the 3 imperial rulers each had their royal yacht, Standard for the Russians, Hohenzollern for the Germans, and Victoria and Albert for the British. Of the 3, Kaiser Wilhelm's was pretty bad. Its navigation officer prior to World War I, the then commander Erich Raeder, said that it was unsafe to take to sea. Why would Wilhelm, sea-minded as he was, have a royal yacht good only for the Channel and Baltic cruises? I think there's a number of factors involved. Partly, it could be that the ship was designed as a dual-purpose ship, at least officially, so it could be used as an aviso by the Imperial German Navy in time of war, which may have compromised its design away from being a pure yacht like, say, the Victoria and Albert. Another factor is that it seems to have been designed, built, fitted out and commissioned very quickly, which may have led to some shortcuts being taken. And its builder was really in the business of building small yachts, royal yachts, which are essentially very, very small passenger liners, particularly, so they may not have had a huge amount of experience in that particular size and type of vessel. They had built considerably larger vessels, or passenger carrying, but there are some things that don't really scale. And I think as an overall result of all of that, I think that contributed somewhat to the poor build quality because she was known to be quite leaky. But the rolling issue, which is what made her be judged unseaworthy primarily by radar, I think comes down to potentially because of being also designed as an aviso, or for whatever other reason, maybe an effort to reach a relatively high top speed, given that she's using vertical triple expansion engines. This is a pre-turbine vessel, and she's still hitting over 21 knots. Her length to beam ratio means she's very fine. Her length to beam ratio is well over 8, which is the length to beam ratio of the Standard, and the Victoria and Albert has a length to beam ratio that's even less than that. So with a very, very fine length to beam ratio, that would help increase her speed, but it's also going to mean, as with most very long, narrow ships, it's incredibly vulnerable to heavy rolling. So you take a ship like that out to sea, where, of course, as you can see from the overall structure, it's going to have a relatively large amount of top weight. And the fact that she rolled like a toy in a bathtub really isn't that surprising. Cringe Pog asks, this will probably require a video in itself, but briefly, what were a few of the problems with Billy Mitchel's bombing tests? I've heard some people talk about him as though he was some form of harbinger of a new period that the slow-minded admirals hated for trying to show the future, whilst others say he didn't have a clue as to what he was trying to do. Yeah, that's definitely going to be a Wednesday video at some point next year. I've already tentatively entitled that Billy Mitchel, How to be Fractally Wrong, because, as the title might suggest, I am very much in the second camp you describe. Billy Mitchel is... his tests and his general advocacy are a classic example of a broken clock is right twice a day, in that, yes, technically he was correct in that air power would eventually prove a decisive advantage over surface warships. That's about the only thing he was right about. So, very briefly, some of the problems with the tests that he undertook, the bombing tests on various ships, including SMS Ostfriesland, which you can see here, range from flat-out misrepresenting what the tests are. So you look at headlines both then and even in some books that have been written since, they describe it as a German super dreadnought, the Germany's latest battleships, effectively trying to put it into people's heads that this ship that had been sunk was the latest and greatest vessel that Germany could put out. It was a modern warship, and it had been done in by the heroic Billy Mitchel and his collection of bombers. In fact, it wasn't. Obviously, those of you who recognise the name will know immediately, and Ostfriesland was not the latest and greatest in German battleship design, not by a long, long shot. Even with the curtailments of war and then losing the war, the Germans had built 3 generations of battleships after her. She's a Helgoland class, so they built the Kaisers, the Königs, and the Bayerns. And if you look at the armour protection scheme of either a Bayern or an L-20E Alpha, which would have been probably the more accurate one to use if any of them had been built, but at least a Bayern, you'll notice that the latest and greatest in German battleship design included such things like anti-torpedo defences, anti-torpedo bulkheads, and so forth. Whereas on the Helgolands, essentially that defence amounted to torpedo nets, which had subsequently been taken off. There wasn't any real anti-torpedo defences in terms of bulkheads and void and liquid-filled layers, the way we would conceive of a late 1910s, 1920s, 1930s era ship. She was also completely stationary, She was completely unmanned, so there was no damage control going on. Most of her hatches and bulkheads doors were left open, so she was essentially in about as vulnerable a condition as it was possible to be in for a warship. Of course, there was also zero defensive fire coming back from said warship, and yet Mitchel claimed that this represented wartime conditions, when it did nothing of this. It represented nothing of the sort. He was also using level bombing. Now, granted, the Navy in the test had actually specified that they weren't to use aerial torpedoes because they knew that torpedoes would sink battleships already. That wasn't exactly a brand new thing. So Mitchel could have argued, the Navy's trying to stop me from sinking ships using aircraft by forbidding me from using torpedoes, but instead he insisted that his level bombing with what passed for the time for being strategic bombers would do the job. But as we know from history, level bombing against any warship was almost entirely unsuccessful. Very, very, very few aircraft ever scored hits on warships that were underway using level bombing, and fewer still of those hits were ever actually decisive. There were one or two, but that's compared to the sheer number of bombs dropped on ships by level bombing aircraft as opposed to, say, dive bombers or torpedo bombers, it's a really spectacularly ineffective tactic. Plus, thanks to the limitations of the time period, the entire test, which was done 50 miles offshore, was difficult for the bombers under Mitchel to actually find, and barely within their operational range. So it's like, even if everything else he said was true, he'd proven that as long as a ship didn't come within 50 miles of an enemy coastline, then it would be fine, which, considering you can conduct an effective blockade beyond that distance, and as we said, if the ship was underway, crewed, closed up for action, capable of defensive fire, would have had very different results. Yeah, his entire test was basically pointless. What sunk Ostfriesland wasn't even direct hits. It was essentially the mining effect of near misses. Now, that can cause problems. I mean, obviously it did for Ostfriesland, because a near miss by a sufficiently large bomb will rupture hull plating, which will allow water in, which eventually, if everything is open and no one's there to fix it, will sink the ship. But again, as we know from history, as it turns out, near misses, unless it's against destroyers, are spectacularly ineffective at sinking vessels, because if you have all your compartments closed up for action and you have damage control crews, then the splinter damage and started rivets and buckled plating you get from those near misses, yes, they're annoying, but you can relatively easily contain and or plug that damage and continue on, assuming that, the enemy hit anywhere close in the first place. So yeah, his tests were spectacularly misrepresented, and the actual tactics that he used, as history proves, and as even the admirals at the time knew, were essentially completely ineffective unless you were prepared to throw thousands upon thousands of sorties with tens of thousands of bombs at something in exchange for maybe sinking one or two destroyers, which is obviously a little bit of a waste of effort. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers, completely separate issue, but Mitchel wasn't testing those. Okay, again, admittedly, the dive bomber had yet to be invented, and the torpedo bomber he was forbidden from using, but that's not what he said. He said his tactics worked, and realistically, they didn't. Bob Hedges asks, how long can munitions last in and around the time frame that the channel covers? I know USAF F-105s were carrying bombs made for the B-17 fleet during the Vietnam War, and as you know, one of the issues raised in the investigation of the Forrestal fire dealt with aging munitions. How long could shells or bombs, etc. be safely used? How are they ideally stored? And how do you dispose of them when they're past time to keep in the inventory? Unfortunately, there is no one correct answer. Very broadly, it depends on three primary factors. What is the explosive that you've got in the munition? How is it encased? And what are the storage conditions? Now, in reverse order, the storage conditions, ideally you want to store munitions in a relatively cool, dry environment. Humidity will cause munitions to degrade, and extremes of temperature will cause munitions to degrade. Heat, particularly, but also with some explosives, extreme cold. And changes in temperature will also reduce your munitions lifespan. So even if you're, say, normally storing munitions at 10 degrees centigrade, so relatively chilly but not too bad, which you could do, if that swings back and forth between 10 and 20, and on a fairly constant basis, that's actually going to be worse for the munitions than maybe storing it at 15 consistently, assuming that the explosive in question doesn't have a particular issue that shows up in that 5-degree band. Then you've got the encasement of the explosive itself. Charge bags, for example, for battleship main guns, they are in usually silk bags. Those are obviously much more prone to being affected by and infiltrated by various conditions, changes in humidity, changes in temperature, etc., which, amongst other reasons, is why they are stored in their own cases. Of course, if those cases degrade or you store those charges outside of those cases, munitions will degrade quicker. And finally, perhaps the most importantly when it comes to shelf life, the type of explosive you're using. If you're using something that's either relatively stable or has been stabilized, then assuming you store it in decent conditions and decent temperatures, etc., and especially if it's within a shell, as opposed to within a charge bag, because within a shell it's completely enclosed in a lot of metal, which is relatively inert, then your munition might last for a very long time. Conversely, if you use, say, first-generation British cordite or French poudre B, that stuff's going to degrade very quickly in the matter of a few years, regardless of what you do. You could store a magazine full of cordite, first-gen cordite or poudre B in the most ideal conditions possible, and it would still become dangerously unstable, if not outright explode on you, before the decade was out without, further checking and so forth. Conversely, if you use much more stabilized cordite, like, say, the British were using in the 30s, or American shell propellant of the same time period, that stuff, assuming you store it correctly, will last much, much, much longer. And that stuff is so safe, relatively speaking, that, as I mentioned in the Arizona destruction video, when you look at Arizona when she was destroyed, the majority of the actual explosion was the black powder. The magazines, where the propellant cooked off, was more of a rapid deflagration than a full-on explosion, somewhat admittedly helped by the fact that the black powder had opened up the magazines to the open air. There probably still would have been an explosion if that hadn't happened, but the magazines caught fire, but, regardless. So, based on all of those factors, the safe storage time varies massively. Once you get to a point of they are reaching the end of their service life, it depends exactly where they sit on that spectrum. So if you are, for example, storing early generation cordite, and you've worked out that, okay, the first batches we used are pretty much degraded to uselessness or dangerous levels of decay after 6 years, and you have 5-year-old cordite in your magazines, then you can just expend that in a training exercise. And the same thing with shells. Once you've got to a point where it's after its safe use by date, then you have to very gingerly extract it from wherever it is you're storing it. And the usual naval solution in the time period that the channel covers is to stick it on the back of a ship and chuck it over the side in somewhere relatively deep and hope it doesn't come back. Paul Goyne asks, if the Royal Navy had decided after the Washington Treaty that what they really needed was more battlecruisers, do you think an effective design could have been developed at 35,000 tons? And if so, how would the design have differed from that of the Nelsons? Yeah, pretty effective design could have been done. The Royal Navy did actually think about this, because obviously you had the design lineages that had led to the N3, which was going down the alphabet, and the G3, which was coming back up the alphabet, for battleships and battlecruisers respectively. Now, when the Washington Treaty was being negotiated and they're looking at a 35,000 ton limit, the Royal Navy actually looked at both a battleship that was 35,000 ton compliant, which obviously following on from N3 became O3, which actually went on to become Nelson and Rodney. But going at the other direction, they went from G to F and created F2 and F3, 2 meaning a ship with twin turrets, and 3 a ship with triple turrets. And so F2 and F3 were in direct competition with what would eventually become the Nelson class. I mean, if you want to be really specific, it would have been F3 specifically is the most equivalent to the Nelson class. Now, these are all forward ship layouts. F3, obviously, triple 15s. F2, twin 15s. So they've dropped an inch to try and save some weight in main gun caliber. In both cases, they actually have a different turret layout to the Nelson slightly, in that Nelson B turret is the super firing one. In this case, it's actually C turret that is the super firing one, the aftmost of the main guns. Now, what you might be immediately able to tell from this top-down view compared to the Nelson is the superstructure is considerably further forward, and that's because as battle cruisers, they need more engine power, so the engine spaces, the boiler rooms, occupy a considerably larger portion in the aft section of the ship. And the main difference between F2 and F3 is that because F3 needs the room for triple turrets and the magazine space, etc., that impinges slightly on the boiler space, which means that F2 is capable of 30 knots, F3 is only capable of about 29 knots on paper, and F2 comes in at just under 35,000 tons, so would probably be fine. F3, because remember these are still sketch designs, as a sketch design was 35,000 tons, which would mean either interesting economizing on weight would need to be done, as was done with Nelson's, or it would end up overweight. I suspect the former, if they'd gone with that option, would have occurred. And interestingly enough, for a 29-knot battlecruiser armed with 9 15-inch guns, it's very well protected, bearing in mind that much, much further down the line, the Iowa class, and indeed, well, the South Dakotas as well, are equipped with an internal sloped armour belt of 12-inch thickness, inclined at 19 degrees. The F2 and F3s had 2 separate thicknesses of armour, inclined at 18 degrees, so only a degree off of an Iowa class, but whereas the Iowas have 12 or 12.1, depending on your source, of belt armour generally, F2 and F3 have 12 inches of inclined belt armour over the machinery, but 13.5 inches of inclined belt armour over the magazines. So they're actually slightly better protected than an Iowa class in terms of absolute belt thickness and equivalent belt thickness as well, because the difference between 18 and 90 degrees is relatively negligible. They are, of course, even with F3 using 1-inch smaller caliber guns, and in the case of F3, they're 4 knots slower, which shows you just how much you have to pay to get up to the speed of an Iowa, but there you go. So yeah, if they decided they really needed more battle cruisers, then I think F3 is the one they probably would have gone with. You also note slightly lighter secondary battery, only 4 twin turrets as opposed to 6. And whilst it might sound like heresy to say, I actually think F3 would have been a little bit more useful for the Royal Navy in the Second World War for a number of reasons. I mean, the speed means that she's capable, that, you know, Rodney and Nelson, they probably still would have been called the same thing, would have been capable of operating alongside the King George V's as well as Hood, etc. Maybe they could have gotten refitted in the 1930s with even better power plants to push their speed up a bit. Probably not, because like Nelson and Rodney, historically, they would have been the more modern ships in the fleet. But that really nice big open back end, which obviously is necessary because of the amount of machinery they have to carry, that's ripe for installing a massive amount of anti-aircraft firepower, in my opinion. And, you know, 3 triple 15-inch guns, that's still going to lay the hurt on a lot of people, plus, especially with this particular turret layout, it can approach at an optimal angle. Not bow tanking World of Warship style, but close enough to it, which would mean that very, very potentially, in the event that Bismarck sails in 1941, you could have had one or both of these things charging down Bismarck, in addition to, or instead of, Hood and Prince of Wales. and these things will be much, much better capable of taking her on. The Freaker 86 asks, much has been said about and written about the Allies capturing the Enigma machine and breaking Enigma encryption, but to my knowledge, there was no instance where the Axis captured cryptographic devices or codes from Allied ships. Am I wrong, and if so, which incidents was or were it the Axis got their hands on such intel, and how much or how long did the Axis powers profit from the capture? In terms of Allied warships, I'm not aware of any cases where an Allied warship was captured or salvaged with any substantial amount of cryptographic material, whether it be in the form of machines or code books, intact in the Second World War. However, I do know of at least one major incident where a lot of decoding books and intel was seized, and that was the capture by the German Hilfskreuzer Atlantis at the end of 1940 of the merchant ship SS Automedon, which, for somewhat unfathomable reasons, was carrying an absolutely huge amount of intel, cryptographical, not equipment as in encoding machines, but cryptographical material in the form of code books and decoding books, analysis of the British position in the Far East. It was pretty much an intel gold mine, and not only was it captured by the Atlantis, but in the circumstances of the capture, for whatever reason, the crew didn't actually throw any of it overboard or destroy any of it. And so, Atlantis's captain went, this might be a little useful. And so he sent a full copy over to the Japanese, and then obviously sent a copy back home as well. What exact effect the receipt of a full British analysis of their defences and potential responses to war in the Far East might have had on the Japanese ideal to launch a war in the Western Pacific, well, that will remain to be seen, but you can probably guess it was incredibly helpful to them. As far as I'm aware, I don't know if any Japanese documents have been translated that actually say what the Japanese thought from their side of things, but who knows, that might happen in the future. John McDonough asks, has there ever been an equivalent to a shell shortage or crisis in naval history? I'm specifically thinking about the transition from peace to war. How often have navies found themselves going from what they thought was an adequate peacetime fleet to a panic about inadequate fleet numbers? With a little bit of clarification, I'm not talking about a navy that knew going into the conflict it would be outnumbered, like Imperial Japan or Germany, but a competent navy that's done their homework and gotten exactly what they wanted from the politicians, only to still find themselves short of what they actually needed. I think very rarely has any navy actually got everything they wanted from politicians, and as a result, when war comes, at almost all points, navies have found themselves short of what they needed. There have been some exceptions. For example, what is broadly termed the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, technically the War of the First, Second and Third Coalitions. There's such a short time period between the conclusion of a peace and the outbreak of the next war that you've got a wartime fleet that hasn't had a huge amount of time to downsize, and so is broadly ready to go in the Royal Navy's case. But, even looking at the Royal Navy and the US Navy in the 1930s, they certainly weren't getting everything they wanted from the politicians, even though they had done their homework and had a rough idea of what they could at least try to get. And the Royal Navy found itself in 1939 with far more commitments than it realistically had ships for. And then, even more so once the French Navy fell out of the running, it found itself very overstretched, largely because they'd been planning for a war in late 41, early 42. So a lot of their shipbuilding programs that were coming online during 39, 40, 41, they were all things that they were supposed to get in peacetime and ended up not getting. Flower-class corvettes, for example. Theoretically, the Royal Navy should have had a nice fleet of corvettes ready to go in for the outbreak of war, but thanks to war coming early, they ended up being built, or at least commissioning, during the war. And the same with the US Navy. You know, the US Navy wanted a lot of stuff in the 30s. And thanks to their slightly delayed entry into the Second World War, they even managed to persuade Congress to open the floodgates on construction ahead of actual war breaking out. But even in that case, they still found themselves short of ships in some cases, thanks to losses and so forth over the course of 1942, because the real effects of that mass ship construction that was just started in 40 and 41 really didn't start to kick in until 43. And sometimes it could be limited to a specific type of vessel. So, for example, a rare instance of the Navy actually having been funded to something approximating what they wanted and still coming up a bit short on things would be the Crimean War. And that's because, thanks to the Anglo-French naval arms race, well, the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale were the first and second largest navies on the planet, and now they were teaming up against a navy that definitely wasn't even the third largest navy on the planet. So, yeah, that was a rather predictable result. But even then, when it came to the latter stages of the Baltic campaign, the Royal Navy found itself with almost an embarrassment of large frigates and first-rate ships of the line, but not a huge amount of shallow draft bombardment and combat vessels. Now, obviously, over down with the attack at Kinburn, for example, the French invented the armoured floating battery, and the Royal Navy, in preparation for what they thought was going to be the next campaign year, ended up suddenly mass-producing hundreds upon hundreds of shallow draft gunboats, effectively reinventing a steam-powered, slightly smaller version of the old Age of Sail bomb vessel. And then, of course, the Russians threw in the towel, and so you just had literal sheds worth, as in, boat sheds full of gunboats, which some of them rotted away. The Royal Navy put others to good use in other areas of the world over time. But it's always interesting to contemplate what would have happened had the Crimean War gone on another 6 months. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, I'm currently reading through The Catalpa Rescue by Peter Fitzsimmons, which details the jailbreak and escape aboard the Catalpa of 6 Fenian prisoners from Fremantle Prison in Western Australia. The plot was almost stopped by colonial police on April 19, 1876, when an armed steamer caught up with the Catalpa and fired a warning shot, to which the Catalpa's captain raised an American flag. The captain of the Catalpa declared that boarding or firing upon the Catalpa would be an act of war against America, which forced the colonial police to disengage, allowing Catalpa to escape. Assuming instead that the colonial police pushed ahead and seized the Catalpa, leading to an incident which would eventually escalate into war between Britain and America, how prepared were the Royal and US Navies at this time to fight in a major conflict? How would the naval battles play out considering the technology of the period, and how would the war affect history moving forward? Well, I suspect that any such incident would have been resolved diplomatically for 2 reasons, because although the Fenian prisoners had a fair amount of sympathy in the US at the time, this would have been an unauthorized jailbreak by a US citizen who had not in any way, shape or form consulted the US government. So, faced with potential war, they probably would have tried to sweep it under the rug as best they could. And for very good reason, not just because it would have been an unauthorized activity by a US citizen causing an international incident, but simply because the US Navy was probably at one of its least ready points to fight anybody at this stage. So a few years earlier, before 1876, when you had the Virginius affair in the early 1870s, a single Spanish ironclad showing up in New York, much as a Brazilian ironclad showing up a few decades later would, had caused a huge panic because they'd realized that there was nothing in the US Navy that could actually defeat it. So in 1876, depending on exactly which source you use for commissioning dates, the Royal Navy had somewhere between 38 and 40 battle-ready ironclads that could potentially be deployed to US waters. That's not including ships like Cerberus or Abyssinia that were tied to specific areas of defence. The US, and by the way, that included up to and including HMS Devastation, and HMS Thunderer was about to come online. The US had USS Dictator, as seen here. And yes, That's a late Civil War era monitor. That's it. Every single other ironclad the US possessed had either, like New Ironsides, caught itself on fire, or been sold for scrap, sold for breaking up, sold to another country, or in a very, very few cases was sitting quietly rotting away in reserves and would turn out to be completely unserviceable. Outside of that, the sum total strength of the US Navy consisted of a few sloops of war, some wood-hulled, some iron-hulled, and a variety of small gunboats, but in total the active service contingent of the US Navy, right down to a gunboat, was scarcely larger than the Royal Navy's fleet of major ocean-going ironclads. And then, of course, the Royal Navy has all sorts of additional ships, all the way down to gunboats, available to it. So, yeah, the Royal Navy at this stage, whilst its ironclad fleet is very eclectic and almost entirely made up of one-offs, there's a lot of them, and they're prepared to enter a conflict. The US Navy basically isn't. So, how would the naval battles play out? I suspect incredibly similar, in fact, possibly even a more one-sided version of the latter stages of the War of 1812, because unlike the War of 1812, where at least the big US frigates could challenge British frigates one-on-one, in this case, Dictator cannot challenge any modern Royal Navy ironclad in anything like a straight-up fight, and the rest of the sloops and stuff, are just effectively write-offs in the face of anything that large enough that the British might send it to the other side of the Atlantic. So what would probably happen is some of the ironclads that have sails, which is pretty much all of them except for Devastation, will maybe be assigned to the major port. So you'd have an ironclad assigned to New York, one to Boston, one for Baltimore, etc., primarily operating on sail, supporting a blockading squadron of various frigates and sloops and corvettes and so forth, of reasonably large number, maybe half a dozen or so, and shut down the eastern seaboard pretty darn quickly. And the Royal Navy can do that fairly effectively. They don't have to do a huge amount else. The US Army is similarly tiny. They're not going after Canada anytime soon. And the Royal Navy can just sit there and go, well, there's absolutely no way for you to actually fight us, because if you send out any ship, we'll blow it out of the water. And just, well, if they really, really want to play passive-aggressive, wait for the American economy to gradually strangle itself and then say, well, there's massive economic disaster that's overtaking you. It could be stopped at any moment if you just say sorry, and, we'll let you go back to the way things were. As far as affecting history, well, US-British relations weren't the greatest in the 1870s. So it may not as radically affect Anglo-American relations as you might otherwise think. But on the other hand, when you get to World War I and there's a significant minority voice in the US pushing for the US to try and help out Germany more than the UK, that's on the background of strained relations, but no direct actual conflict since the War of 1812. So who knows how that might affect things going forward. Because any kind of conflict in the late 1870s will still be within living memory of a decent portion of the population in 1914. So I suspect whether this goes into, possibly making the US either not side with the Allies or side with the Germans in World War I is probably going to depend entirely on the severity of the conflict. If the conflict as it develops turns out to be the Royal Navy turns up, shuts down the East Coast, and the US Navy goes, there's literally nothing we can do about this, and the US Navy and then the US government goes, okay, fine, we'll surrender on reasonable terms, might just be a small bump in the road. If it actually turns into a long drawn-out blockade and or somebody tries to break the blockade and you have naval battles of any significant size, there could be a lot greater repercussions. Texas and LaShock asks, in the Great War of Archimedes film, The main plot was trying to prove that the enormous new battleship being proposed would be more expensive than a carrier. If both are fully loaded, battleship with all ordnance and carrier with full wing of aircraft, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, etc., which actually winds up being more expensive? It depends how exactly you categorize it, because it's actually relatively difficult to find aircraft carriers and battleships of about the same displacement being built at the same time. And of course the thing is, do you want to compare them by displacement? Because of course a battleship will displace a lot per foot of length because of the armour and the gun turrets. A carrier will be able to be considerably larger on less displacement because it lacks those things. So do you go by total amount of steel in the water, i.e. displacement, or do you go by length? I mean, if you compare an Essex class to, say, a North Carolina class, the Essex class standard displacement is about 4,500 tons less than the North Carolina class, but it's almost 150 foot longer. So if we were going to stick to one arbitrary standard, let's go with displacement because length can be all sorts of weirdness, then the average cost for an Essex class carrier, when they're being constructed, the early ones at least, you're looking at around $70 to $75 million. Ironically enough, $75 million is about the cost of construction of a North Carolina or South Dakota class battleship. So you're getting 4,500 tons more battleship for the same amount of money. And then once you factor in fuel, I mean, both ships need a fair amount of fuel. It mostly evens out compared to the cost of tens of millions of 1940 to 42 era dollars. The cost of fuel and other supplies like that is relatively minimal. And as I say, they're both fueling up, they're both carrying large amounts of explosives, etc. But where the difference in cost really starts to kick in is with the aircraft. So although the average US Navy carrier aircraft clocks in about $50,000, Avengers obviously cost a bit more than Hellcats, the Hellcat being the roughly $50,000 mark, you end up with a rough air wing cost for an Essex class as adding another $5 million on top of its already existing cost. So if we take the exact midpoint, approximately speaking, of Essex class costs and say $72.5 million for the hull, and then add in the $5 million, you're talking about $77.5 million for 4,500-ish tons less ship. And in terms of ammunition expenditure, at least if you're comparing it to the cost of a 16-inch shell and its charges, interestingly enough, the cost of firing about, roughly speaking, a salvo and a half of 16-inch shells is about the equivalent of losing one $50,000 in 1940s dollars aircraft. So if a carrier sends off a strike and let's say 6 aircraft don't come back and or are written off due to damage, then that's the equivalent of a battleship firing off about 9 salvos. Now, of course, every time an aircraft comes back, it's also expending fuel, it's expending munitions, it's got an ongoing maintenance and upkeep cost as well, which is going to push the cost of operating the carrier's aircraft a lot higher compared to the shells, which once they're gone, they're gone. There is no further cost involved with them. So, very broadly speaking, if you're looking at a carrier and a battleship that's within shouting distance of each other, at least size and displacement wise, it is actually probably slightly more expensive to fully kit out the aircraft carrier, and it's going to be considerably more expensive to actually operate that carrier in combat conditions. Of course, if you are comparing like era with like era carriers and battleships rather than approximately the same size, then you'd be more accurately comparing an Essex class to an Iowa class, in which case the Iowa class is going to be the more expensive ship to build and kit out, even though its operating costs will be slightly lower. But then the Iowa class is also a much bigger ship in terms of displacement, and also actually just about in length. Adam Schindler asks, I heard on the USS Texas tour that the Illinois and Kentucky were to be the first welded battleships in the US Navy, and that even on these ships several critical seams would have been riveted. It seems the catastrophic cracking issues on contemporary all-welded ships like the Liberty ships, coupled with the ability of a riveted joint to stop a crack, meant that 100% welded construction was viewed as too risky on a capital ship. Are there other examples of new and old technology being combined in a compromise effort between efficiency and safety? There are plenty of examples of this kind of thing happening. Here is a prime example. This is, of course, USS New Jersey, circa earlier this year at some point. And you'll note a whole slew of things from her 1980s refit, radars, various electronic systems. But you'll also notice that a lot of those are perched on the 1940s optical range-finding systems, which she also possesses. Now, obviously, some of those radars are for air search and anti-aircraft fire control direction, but some of them are for surface search and surface gunnery direction. But they didn't take out the optical rangefinders from either their positions on the fire control directors or, in most cases, from the turrets, because they work perfectly well and they will continue to work in electronically interesting environments where the radar won't. And you even look these days perhaps on modern nuclear submarines. In theory, you could have some variant of a modern turboelectric drive where the reactor generates heat, which can be turned into power, which can be turned into electricity, which can then drive the sub via electric motors, which one or two subs have tried. But the vast majority of nuclear-powered subs are, hilariously enough, given the shenanigans with the K-class, flat-out steam turbine-driven submarines. The only difference being that their power source, where the heat comes from, is a reactor which doesn't have an exhaust as compared to an oil-fired boiler back in the old K-class. And with gun turrets, for example, the older school technology to get your gun turrets to move was hydraulic, or in some later cases electro-hydraulic. Now, you could, again, get your turrets to move entirely via the power of electricity, using electric motors, and indeed the French pioneered and got quite good at this, but you'll find that an awful lot of warships equipped with turrets of varying descriptions, even up till World War II, and even well beyond it in some cases, will still be using electro-hydraulic technology, because whilst the guns and the equipment in the turrets might have been upgraded quite considerably from the time period when electro-hydraulic tech was first implemented, it works and is pretty darn reliable. Also, if you can believe it, and as an engineer, when I first heard it, it sounded a little bit unbelievable to me, but the failure state of a high-pressure electro-hydraulic system for a battleship's turret is actually somewhat less lethal than the failure state of the same system except purely electricity. Graham William Kidd says, in Drydock 79, you highlighted a potential, frankly incredible geopolitical flow on it for events if Britain had actually delivered the Ottomans their two dreadnoughts. What other small naval butterflies could have had such a massive impact? Preferably not a battle outcome, but something that the average guy might not necessarily think about. Well, if somebody had bothered to properly insulate the magazines on the USS Maine, or indeed someone had just popped down into the bunkers to see what was going on every so often, then Maine wouldn't have exploded in Cuba. And if Maine doesn't explode, then the Spanish-American War probably doesn't kick off. If the Spanish-American War doesn't kick off, then the US Navy, although it had recently had a bit of an expansion, probably doesn't quite get the same level of digging in and further funding expansion the way that it did historically, which in turn means that by the time the dreadnought race kicks off, the US Navy's fleet of pre-dreadnoughts is going to be smaller. They're probably not going to have the Great White Fleet voyage. And with a smaller navy to start with, and less immediate recent combat impetus behind it, it's possible that the US Navy it will have to go for dreadnoughts eventually, but probably not quite as quickly as it did historically. And if the whole US Navy is not really being taken quite as seriously and funded quite as much as it was in our timeline, Then does the Two Ocean Navy Act come in that prompts the US to build up towards the end of the 1910s, which then results in the Washington Naval Treaty? Maybe, maybe not. There's all sorts of potential outcomes from a slightly smaller US Navy with less drive to it, as well as obviously if it's a smaller Navy with less drive to it, that means fewer officers and men. So some of the officers that we think of these days, especially those from the Second World War, may not have entered US service because there may not have been space for them. Or another potentially very interesting one, what if Nelson had been slightly slower crossing the Mediterranean when he was hunting for Napoleon's army in the campaign that would eventually lead to the Battle of the Nile? On the one hand, if there's a storm, his men are just not quite as good sailors as they historically were, maybe there's a slight course change or something that means they take longer to get to Egypt. But whatever the circumstances, if they're 24 hours slower in crossing the Mediterranean, then they're going to wind up heading up off the coast of Egypt at the same time that Napoleon and his fleet show up. And if Nelson defeats the French fleet at sea instead of in Aboukir Bay, whilst all the troop transports are with them, and those troop transports are either sunk or captured, along with Napoleon himself, Napoleon never becomes emperor. You probably will still have wars going on with revolutionary France, but considering that whilst Napoleon was stuck over in the Middle East, as he historically was by the Battle of the Nile, revolutionary France started to do somewhat terribly. The entire course of history changes at that point, because revolutionary France probably collapses in on itself without Napoleon. Obviously, we don't get the Napoleonic period or the Napoleonic Wars, which could lead to an incredibly different balance of power in the 19th century. And it may not even be a dominant British Empire, because if revolutionary France collapses, some form of monarchy is reinstated, but we haven't had the long, drawn-out, grinding conflict between the start of the 19th century and 1815, Britain won't quite be in the same position of ascendancy. It won't have captured quite the same number of places. It won't have built up so much battle experience. It won't have sunk so many enemy ships. And if France then collapses, you don't have the Battle of Trafalgar. Is Nelson famous? Well, yes, he will be very famous for this not Battle of the Nile. But what happens to his legacy? Is he quite as famous? No. Will he ruin his legacy with his somewhat scandalous social life? Who knows? All of these things from just a 24-hour difference in sailing. Clayton Bradish asks, the Great White Fleet, have there been other outlandish displays of naval peacetime power in history? Yeah, there have been quite a few of varying descriptions. The Spithead Naval Review, for instance, by the Royal Navy, started off as occasionally celebratory, mostly internal celebratory for the, after big battles, and sometimes also for more practical purposes, serving as a marshalling point and sort of a place to congregate ships before resupply and restock, etc. But it wasn't really for that much outside consumption until you got to the end of the 19th century. A few naval reviews had occasionally been held to show off a little bit, but the Spithead reviews in the latter part of the 19th and the very early part of the 20th centuries were as much, if not more, about showing off the might of the Royal Navy to everybody as they were anything else. Partly kind of going, look at how many ships there are, don't mess with us, but partly also the subtext of, look, we've managed to put this many ships, we've got more ships here, the message was, than most of you delegate navies have total navies. And in fact, usually the British contingent outnumbered the entire guest contingent put together. And there are still dozens or hundreds of British warships patrolling the oceans. So those became very big naval peacetime displays of power, but very outlandish as well. Back in the 1850s, you had a French review of its fleet, which was supposed to be to celebrate the opening of Cherbourg as a full naval base, which actually had a little bit too much of an effect, because the idea of France gathering a large portion of its naval might in one place was to show off and celebrate and say, hey, look, we're all being really friendly and we're honouring our visiting guest of honour, who happened to be various high-ranking dignitaries from the UK. And unfortunately, the British kind of took it as an implied threat and ran away afterwards and went, yeah, we think the French are going to try and invade us, quickly build up our fleet, So, yeah, a slightly unintended consequence there. Or maybe it was. Maybe, backrooms of power and all that. Ostensibly, at least, it was supposed to be a polite and friendly thing. And in the 1920s and 1930s, both the US Navy's fleet problems and the Royal Navy's fleet exercises, whilst most of the time they were aimed at exercising the fleet and learning lessons about how they could fight in the future, when you look at the particular scenarios being practiced in some of these exercises, the particular simulated enemies and the particular locations these were held in, you've got an extremely large number of warships being gathered in a very specific place at a very specific time, doing very specific things to send a very specific message. So at that point, given that the exercise is as much about sending the message to someone as it is about actually, doing a fleet exercise, some of them would probably count as outlandish displays of peacetime naval power as well, which, hasn't entirely gone away. Because you could do the modern rim pack exercises, for example, without all the fancy close formation photo ops, but that's almost as much of a point as the exercise itself. Joshua Dworkin asks, what sort of impact could the air wing of USS Enterprise have had on the Kido Butai if they'd actually found the Japanese carriers on the evening of December 7th, 1941? Would the Japanese have had the ability to quickly counterattack Enterprise after the day's events? In terms of a relatively quick counterattack, theoretically, yes, because remember they had the third wave that they never actually launched. So, depending on timing, they could have sent off that third wave against Enterprise. More practically speaking, most likely not, because they needed to turn for home. They had fuel concerns about being discovered, etc., by ships other than a single carrier. But in terms of the impact Enterprise's air wing could have had, it would be somewhere between nothing and everything. And I know that's insanely unhelpful, but unfortunately it is also true, because you could construct very plausible scenarios either way. So you could have, let's say, that Enterprise hears that Pearl Harbor is under attack, marshals all its aircraft, scrambles its entire air wing, fully loaded, ready to go, and they get into the air. They signal ahead of time so that people know that Enterprise's air wing is coming and please don't shoot us down. And maybe their leading fighters manage to catch sight of the last remnants of the Japanese second wave disappearing off over the horizon, and so they follow. But the Japanese don't realize that they're being followed, and so just when all the Japanese carriers are conducting aircraft landing operations, completely out of nowhere, mass strike by Enterprise's air wing. And, okay, whether the torpedoes will actually work or not is another matter entirely, but at that point it is entirely possible that Enterprise's air group might manage to take out 2 or 3 Japanese carriers. If they're really lucky, maybe 1 or 2 under more standard circumstances, but certainly a massive impact. Alternatively, you could have almost exactly the same scenario, except that some Japanese pilot looks in his rearview mirror, or some Japanese tail gunner goes, hang on a minute, and notices they're being followed, at which point the Japanese carriers marshal the first wave fighters and the third wave fighters and send off, massive multi-deck fighter swarm, which bypasses obviously the incoming second wave and completely rips apart Enterprise's air group in the open ocean. And everything in between. So you could run that simulation, I think, a dozen times and get a dozen different results. Grumman Cat asks, much has been made of Admiral Halsey's mistakes and blown calls in the Second World War. Without writing a book on the matter, as Jack Ryan clearly has that covered already, what would you say his strengths and better judgments were during the war? And of course, as we know, Marco Ramius disagrees with that particular book, but nevertheless, as I've kind of mentioned in a few other Drydocks previously, Halsey's main strengths are also his biggest weaknesses. It's just that when you apply that same characteristic at a different point in the US Navy's campaign in World War II, it has very different effects. Halsey is, if you wanted to break it down to really basics, Halsey is an attack dog. He will go after the enemy, and he will keep going after the enemy, and he will keep going after the enemy intentionally until the enemy is annihilated, or until he lacks the capability of any further follow-up on his actions. Now, that requires a huge amount of confidence, as well as obviously aggression. In the first part of the American involvement in World War II, when they're coming off of Pearl Harbor, and whilst they're having successes, they're also getting kicked back in a number of different places. At that point, Halsey's determination to go, actually, what, regardless of what we've lost before, regardless of what the odds might look like, we're going to take the fight to the enemy, and we're going to keep hitting them until one of us can't hit anymore. That is exactly what the US Navy needed to get itself back on its feet mentally and rig itself up for the rest of the conflict. Of course, as I say, the flip side is that once you have the massive material advantage and that kind of attitude has become known to the enemy, it becomes somewhat easier to bait you. But in the early part of the war, that I wouldn't say he single-handedly, but he had a very, very large part in turning the US Navy's attitude around and beginning to forge it into the force that would go on to roll over the Japanese Navy like a steamroller. And tied to that were his judgments as to how to treat forces he was operating alongside, be they the US Marine Corps, US Army Air Force, etc., etc. And recognizing when perhaps there were career naval officers who just weren't cutting it in terms of what was needed to prosecute the war, and either directly replacing them by taking over their command or putting in officers who more closely matched his ideas of what they should be doing. Wisdom in the Shadows asks, separated by era, World War II, World War I, iron and steel, classic sail, medieval, etc., how far back in time would you need to go from the launching of any ship to get to the point where that ship isn't just good, but something akin to an MMO raid boss when compared to its functional or class equivalents? For example, how far back from when USS Alabama is launched do you have to go until it is essentially unsinkable to anything except for a dedicated flotilla of battleships? Unfortunately, the answer time-wise is incredibly varied, but essentially it adds up to basically send the Mach 1 era for a lot of the time periods until you start getting back past about 1600, then it starts to get a bit interesting. So, if you send a late World War II era ship like Iowa or Vanguard back to something like the Battle of Jutland or Yamato or whatever, they're essentially a final boss because they can engage at ranges beyond the capabilities of most battleships at Jutland. They're faster and they're infinitely more accurate with their fire control. And, even if they do close down to, say, 15,000, 20,000 yards, at the Battle of Jutland, 15 to 20,000 yards for most capital ships is long range. For Yamato, Iowa, and Vanguard, especially the latter two with their radars, especially in the murk and the gloom, that's essentially point blank for as far as their accuracy is going to be considered. Conversely, if you were to take Dreadnought or Iron Duke, let's say take Iron Duke at Jutland. So once she's got her fire control systems aboard, you don't have, whereas the World War II ships are sent back about 3 decades, For Iron Duke, you only have to send her back about a decade. If Iron Duke shows up at something like Tsushima, there's nothing anyone there can do to stop her, because the only things that can close in on her are going to get slaughtered because they're so lightly protected. And the battleships, again, massively outranged, massively outgunned. Accuracy is Tsushima is notable for having engaged at 5,000 to 7,000 yards. Iron Duke could sit at 12,000 and happily pot shot pre-dreadnoughts all day long. With the ironclads, ships with long-barreled guns, so 45 caliber guns once the new propellant and metallurgy comes in, so ships of the mid-1890s, for example, if you send them back 20 years, so Harvey or Krupp steeled ships with modern metallurgy and modern propellants, send them back 20 years, they're essentially unstoppable by the ironclads of earlier periods. For the ironclads, send them back 5 years, as long as they're sort of early 1860s ironclads, and they're essentially unstoppable by most of the ships from the previous period. For something like HMS Victory, though, this is where things start to slow down. Victory or Science, Saint-Dismas Trinidad, whatever, would be pretty good the further back you go, but they're, 1750s, that's just before Victory is built. They're not going to be massively out of place. If you sent them back, though, to something like, say, the early to mid-1600s, for, say, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, they're a bit bigger than Sovereign of the Seas, but not massively. But then Sovereign of the Seas was almost an MMO raid boss for the Dutch fleet. So a vessel that's 25, 30, 50% larger than that, armed with a unified main battery and considerably faster firing guns, that's gonna be basically a raid boss to that kind of early Stuart period fleet. Then, of course, if you took something like Sovereign of the Seas and you put it back at the time of the Spanish Armada, it's pretty much a raid boss. If you took a Spanish Armada ship like the Revenge back to, say, the 14th century, when you're essentially just talking about projectile weapons in the form of catapults, if you're really lucky, but more likely just arrow fire, then it's an end boss. But once you get back into the era pre-gunpowder on ships, a medieval cog being sent back and back and back, I mean, okay, as a fighting platform, it would dominate things like longboats in the Viking period, for instance. But once you get even further back, outside of the fact that a decent number of Roman or Greek ships are going to be obviously mostly ramming based and going to have something of a problem against strongly built high-sided sailing vessels like a cog, the same way that the Romans actually had problems against the Gallic ships during their invasion of Gaul. There's nothing particularly about a medieval cog that would make it that much different from a large-ish Mediterranean trade vessel, except for, obviously fine details of design. So, yeah, once you get back to that period, it starts to become a little bit more difficult. Lou is British for John asks, I believe that during World War II there was a satirical warning that an enemy spy could carry off the blueprints for an Iowa-class battleship in a briefcase. I suspect it would probably be more akin to one or more railroad boxcars. How much did those or similar blueprints weigh, and how much space could they take up? It depends greatly on whether you mean the entirety of the ship's blueprints or just the general ones, because you could get a fairly detailed booklet of general plans, which would show you, orthographic views, kind of like you can see here of Akagi, as well as the hull framing diagrams in enough lines to let you build a hydrodynamic model, and deck-by-deck plans showing the size and location of every single compartment. And all of that could fit in a very slim briefcase indeed. That would be enough to, give people a general idea of what someone was building. But there is a huge gap between that and all the ship's blueprints, because once you're getting into all the ship's blueprints, you're talking about individual frame by frame blueprints. You're talking about plans for room layouts and so forth that are almost not quite going room by room, maybe 3 or 4 rooms on a page. You're also then talking about wiring diagrams for the electrics, plumbing diagrams, voice tube diagrams, damage control blueprints, fire control system layout blueprints, and when you're talking plumbing, so plumbing for the ship, but also fire mains, pumps for the counter flooding, pumps for pumping out damage, detailed plans for the guns, detailed plans for the turrets, detailed plans for the fire control equipment, and so on and so forth. At which point, if you're going after every single possible plan, even moulding line plans for things like the bend of the keel and so forth, that level of stuff, at that point you are talking about entire large rooms worth of paper, if not more. Obviously, as time goes on and ships get more complicated, these things get larger and larger until everybody starts storing them on computer files. But there is a difference between getting your hands on every single blueprint, which would basically tell you how to build it right down to the last rivet, and getting enough plans to give you a fairly good idea of the ship's capabilities down to its location of armament, thickness of armor, etc., which the abbreviated version thereof you could get into a briefcase. Nick Preber asks, I've read that USS Houston was slated to have a radar installed and even had a set en route, but the outbreak of war meant that it would never arrive. Is this true? And if so, which model of radar would this have been? Had it been installed, how might it have affected the Battle of Java Sea and Sunda Strait? It wouldn't surprise me at all if that was the case, considering that of the various Northampton-class heavy cruisers, pretty much all of the ones before Houston had radar installed, as did Augusta, which was the one after her. And based on the type of radar that was installed on the previous cruisers and then the type that was installed on Augusta, it probably would have been a CXAM-1 radar set, which is obviously primarily an air search set with limited capability of surface detection as well. So, outside chance it might have been CXAM, but more likely CXAM-1. Would it have affected the Battle of Java Sea and Sunda Strait? Not particularly. CXAM or CXAM-1, as I said, is primarily an air search radar. It can detect enemy vessels on the surface, but at the range that it can detect enemy vessels at the battles of Java Sea and Sunda Strait, there was no problem in seeing and identifying enemy vessels anyway. And at that point, without it having, enough fidelity to act as a gunnery radar, it's basically just going to show them kind of what they already know, which isn't going to help all that much. The launch of the Long Lances, for example, actually took place outside the on-paper surface detection range of CXAM and CXAM-1, which, given that it's an early air search set, isn't a huge, shocking surprise. Kra F1 asks, how common were failed classes of ships, and what would your definition of failed ship class be? Unfortunately, as with so many things, it can be a little bit of a woolly definition, but my personal definition of a failed ship class would be a class of ships that, when constructed, fundamentally fails to fulfill at least one of its major design functions. Now, those design functions might be as simple as stay upright and afloat in normal weather conditions, or it might be something a little bit more esoteric in terms of its mission. So perhaps if you design a ship that's specifically supposed to do commerce protection missions and it turns out to have a hysterically short range, that would be a failed class, because if you don't correct it, obviously, because to do commerce protection you need long range. So it might be, stay upright, be a really good fighting unit, etc., but if it's got a operational range of 2,000 nautical miles, it's useless as a commerce protector. And another way to fail fundamental design issues would be if the class as a whole is designed to solve a particular problem and it turns out it doesn't actually solve it. So in that case, it might meet its mission specification completely. So it might have decent range, the firepower, protection, and speed that you asked it for. But if it's trying to fulfill some slightly higher purpose, then that could also fail. And perhaps the most mundane would be that perhaps if you're building a class and it's obviously supposed to succeed previous examples of similar classes in your Navy's history, and it's just fundamentally worse than previous efforts, then that would also be a failed class, although they might, again, still sail, fight, etc., without rolling over and immediately sinking. If they came across, the previous class's ships, and they just flat out lose when they're not supposed to, that could also be a failed class. And in that respect, some classes of third-rate ships of the line back in the Age of Sail could be described as failed classes. They'd sail, they'd hold the line just as well as anybody else, but their overall sailing capabilities, their agility, their speed, their leakiness, etc., would sometimes have people looking on and going, well, that was certainly an attempt to make things better, but actually I'd rather just sail in, the bunch of ships we built previously. So that's a failed class. The York class heavy cruisers of the Royal Navy, I've mentioned before, you could consider them a failed class. For their size, they actually got a respectable amount of speed, protection, and firepower in the wrapper. And if they came up against like two equivalent classes, they could stand up for themselves pretty well. And indeed, Exeter ship put in a very good showing against Graf Spee. However, the entire point of the York class was to build a credible heavy cruiser detachment that was supposed to be considerably larger, that would save on tonnage so the Royal Navy could have more heavy cruisers. And as it turned out, the York class fundamentally failed in that aspect, which is why there were only ever two of them. And of course, for those of you who've been watching the channel for any length of time and noticed the photo that's been gracing this particular question, of course I'm going to put the Königsbergs in as a failed class because, well, they're supposed to be light cruisers, and about the only good thing you can say about them is that for their weight restrictions, they did at least manage to get a reasonable level of main battery firepower stuck in there. But that's really about it. They are so fragile that they just can't be used for the vast majority of roles that light cruisers are actually used for. And, despite the fact that they have considerably more firepower than an Arethusa class, and indeed actually slightly more firepower even than a Leander class in a straight-up main gun broadside battle, if you had a running fight in the North Sea, in the average North Sea sea state, I'd still be putting my money on the Arethusas or the Leanders, or heck, even a Dido class could probably give a Königsberg a run for its money in a decent sea state. I mean, we're talking about a class of ship whose most notable achievement was managing to lose one of its class members to the skewer. Christopher Dooley asks, I was looking at photos of the SMS Königsberg of Rufiji Delta fame and noticed its primary armament scattered across the ship in various single mount barbettes. How was fire control across all the different guns on the ships of this layout and this time period managed? I can imagine centralised target designation, let alone true fire control, would be a massive challenge when every gun is at a different height above the waterline and angle to the target, assuming that they all know to shoot at the same target. And now we get to talk about a Königsberg class that didn't suck completely. They're relatively reasonable small light cruisers. Now, as far as this 1905 class, this description is actually of the Königsberg class, but Jane seems to have missed that Königsberg was the lead ship of the class, never mind. Anyway, you can see the armament layout in question. Now, one thing you've got to bear in mind is that when these ships are designed, bear in mind that Königsberg herself is started in 1905, so their design is the first half of the 1900s. Rangefinders are a pretty new technology, and centralised fire control is essentially future tech. Centralised firing via electrical circuits might have come in a little while back, but the first fire control tables aren't going to be installed into capital ships until after 1910. And that's starting with the big ships. And even on those big ships, fire control directors and fire control director tables aren't being installed for every bit of armament on capital ships. They're being installed for the primary batteries only, not the secondaries. So for a relatively small protected cruiser or light cruiser like the Königsbergs, they're not going to be designed with centralized director controlled fire control systems, because those systems simply don't exist. And even in the run-up to World War I, once those systems start to get into various fleets, these ships are going to be so far down the priority list it's not even funny. So each of these guns would have to be individually aimed by their gun crews. Now, of course, you can retrofit rangefinders onto the ship, on top of the bridge or onto one of the masts, etc., and that'll give you a slightly better idea of what range you should be aiming at. But at that point, you then have to just inform the gun crews, hey, this is the range that we think we should be firing at. Each of the gun crews will then have to lay their guns on target using their own training, and then either fire when they think they have the bearing and the range, or potentially have all the guns fired centrally. But on these kinds of small ships where you've got lots of individual open mounts, it's most often a case of, well, we can tell you where the enemy ship is and what we think the range is, and everything else is down to the skills of the individual gun crews. John McCarthy asks, I've been wondering how World War II magnetic exploders for torpedoes worked, and why navies had such trouble getting them to work reliably. I've heard that they sometimes exploded unexpectedly when far from home port, and that seems to imply they must have set them up to trigger if the magnetic field changed from a preset value, like the field at the factory. If they used induction, like the wires in the roads to trigger traffic lights, this wouldn't have happened. Can you explain? Yes, so the reason they didn't use an induction loop is because an induction loop has to be itself powered. It generates its own magnetic field, which the presence of a vehicle disturbs, and they work at pretty close ranges. If you were going to use an induction loop on a torpedo that would be any better than just a contact detonator, you would have to be pumping massive amounts of power through the torpedo warhead, which, frankly, torpedoes at that time didn't have that kind of power generation capability. Whereas the magnetic detonators in torpedoes, and indeed as they were first used in the First World War, mines, use the fact that obviously the Earth has a magnetic field, which is how magnetic compasses work, and as magnetic compasses also prove, the presence of a large amount of ferrous metal, like, say, a multi-thousand-ton ship, disturbs that field, which is why they have to correct magnetic compasses when they're installed on large vessels. And the idea of the magnetic detonator is that the torpedo, once the detonator has been armed, sails happily along. It has been set to a general level of background magnetic field, which is what you'd expect. And then when there is a perturbation in that field, such as the fact it's approaching a large mass of ferrous material, it goes, detonation time. Because something has changed. And more specifically, something has changed to a great enough degree to set it off. And pretty much as you indicated, this was normally set at the background magnetic field as per the factory or the testing area in which the torpedoes were developed. And this is the fundamental problem with the early World War II detonators, and indeed with the late World War I detonators as well, which is that the Earth's magnetic field actually varies in strength depending on how close you are to the equator or how close you are to the North Pole. At the equator, it's weaker. At the North and South Poles, it's stronger. Now, although the German magnetic detonators in their magnetic mines at the end of World War I did have some problems, the distance between northern Germany and the southern and middle parts of the UK, and even some of the northern parts of the UK, wasn't so dramatic that it rendered them completely useless. But what they discovered is that the further north you went, such as, say, for the Germans, the Norwegian campaign, the magnetic field of the Earth off of the coasts of Norway, especially when you go really far north in Norway like Narvik, is substantially stronger than it is in northern or central Germany. Which means if you set your detonator to go off once the magnetic field has increased beyond a certain strength, and you fire it at, say, HMS Warspite, well, compared to if you were firing it in Wilhelmshaven Harbour, your detonator, using an arbitrary number, for example, might already be 80% of the way towards triggering, at which point the very edge of the perimeter of Warspite's magnetic field might be enough to trip it off, so it detonates prematurely. Or in an alternate type of magnetic detonator setup, you could have your torpedo set to detonate when there is a sufficient enough variance in the magnetic field. But if the background magnetic field is so strong, then the variance caused by, let's say, HMS Warspite's hull might not be a sufficiently large variance in percentage terms to set off the magnetic detonator. And in the Western Pacific, which is much closer to the equator relative to where the Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 exploder were developed, the opposite can apply. So if your magnetic detonator is looking for a total increase in magnetic field, the magnetic field down there is so much weaker that even the increase caused by the presence of a large amount of ferrous metal may not be enough to set it off, so you end up with a dud. And the flip side of how it works, if it looks for a percentage variance in such a weak magnetic field, the presence of a ship might cause a percentage-wise huge variance, even if that variance isn't actually that great number. So again, using completely arbitrary examples, if you have the magnetic field and its strength is, let's say, 10 units, and a ship generates 2 units of variance, well, obviously in that case the variance is 20%. But if the magnetic field is has a value of 2 units and the ship is still causing a variance of 2 units, well, that's 100% difference, and obviously that will cause a premature. So what it all boiled down to was fundamentally nobody seemed to have grasped the idea that the Earth's magnetic field would actually vary considerably depending on how far north or south you were relative to the equator and the poles. Now, that principle was almost certainly understood by other scientists, but that doesn't reach the people who were developing these particular detonators. And essentially, the fundamental way to fix it was to realize that fact and work out a way for the torpedo detonators to either be calibrated at manufacture for the magnetic field strength of the approximate latitude the torpedo was likely to be employed in, or to have a way for it to establish a kind of base setting at launch, or for the crew to set a base setting at launch, depending on how well you trusted the crew to interpret, or even have the equipment to be able to interpret, magnetic field strength in their local area. Rodney McCoy asks, I'm not sure I've ever heard this hypothetical discussed. Could Japanese Navy aircraft have operated off of the German Graf Zeppelin? Yes, they absolutely could in general principle. I mean, obviously, the Graf Zeppelin wasn't set up to handle Japanese Navy aircraft, so you'd have to completely rework the interior, possibly even the elevators, to make sure they fit and had all the correct weapons and so forth available. But in terms of could Japanese aircraft be sat on the flight deck of Graf Zeppelin and take off, absolutely they could. Fun fact for you, actually, Graf Zeppelin is actually a longer vessel than any of the Kido Butai's big 6 carriers from the start of the Pacific campaign. Even the mighty Akagi is actually a little shorter than Graf Zeppelin, the Shikakus as well. Admittedly, you're only talking by maybe 20 to 30 feet, but still, it's there. And obviously on most of the Japanese carriers, they don't have full-length flight decks, neither does Graf Zeppelin, as you can see, but they all have this little termination at the bow. So Graf Zeppelin's overall flight deck length is actually going to be longer than the flight deck length on any of the Kido Butai carriers. So anything that can operate off of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, or Zuikaku can comfortably operate off of Graf Zeppelin as well. In fact, can operate even better. The big problem with Graf Zeppelin's aircraft was that they were taken off of land-based aircraft, but obviously not all land-based aircraft make terrible fighter conversions on carriers. But in the particular choices, the ME-109 or BF-109 if you're early enough in the war, and the Ju-87, they both actually have quite considerable takeoff distances that are in excess of even Graf Zeppelin's flight deck, and certainly in excess of Graf Zeppelin's flight deck if you were taking off from, say, halfway or two-thirds of the way down, rather than full length. Even with a headwind, you're cutting it very close, which is why they were going to have to use catapults and obviously heavily modify the aircraft. If you're going pedal to the metal straight into a fairly decent headwind, then maybe some of Graf Zeppelin's aircraft, if they were taking off right from the back end, could get airborne without catapult help. But most, if they have a full flight deck strike package ready to launch, the forward aircraft are never going to make it. As compared to something like the A6M, which, assuming you were running at full speed with the carrier, even if there wasn't any other headwind other than the carrier's speed, could quite happily take off in less than about a third of Graf Zeppelin's flight deck length. This was one of the reasons why, for example, the Spitfire conversion to the Seafire was considerably more successful than the German attempts to convert the ME-109 into a carrier fighter, despite the fact that British carriers have considerably shorter flight decks than Graf Zeppelin does, simply because the Spitfire-Seafire has a fundamentally considerably shorter takeoff run in the first place. Of course, the fact it tended to break its back on landing is a slightly concerning but otherwise different matter to actually getting off the flight deck initially. Vintage Car History asks, on my channel I sometimes speak of what I call convergent engineering in the automotive world. Benz and Daimler working at about the same time to do the same thing, completely independent of each other. Gobber Briley and Arrol Johnson both inventing engines with 2 pistons per cylinder with no communication between them, and so on. Are there any significant examples of convergent engineering in the naval technological world? Yes, there's quite a few different ones. A really basic one is the propeller. On my video about propellers and propulsion, for example, at one point, a few people in the comments have turned up and said, oh, well, why did you talk about Francis Petit-Smith's development of the propeller and this kind of shows you the kind of field you're in, when insert X name here, and about 4 or 5 different names have been suggested by about half a dozen different commentators, actually invented the screw propeller 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years before him, and his work was just a reinvention of it. And this is kind of, my actual response to that is simply that I track the development of things from the time they were developed and actually caught on. If you were to track the development of everything in extreme detail every single time something was invented but then was never really adopted for various reasons, you'd be there all day. I mean, I got the same kind of grief in my tanks and the Navy video, where people say, oh yes, well, XYZ invented the armoured car. It's like, yes, but nobody cared. They invented the armoured car, sure, and then no one adopted it. There was no follow-on development. It was a dead end. Whereas the armoured cars I was referring to are basically the start of a continuous line of development. Anyway, getting back to your question, propellers, good example of convergent engineering, because there's very little, if any, evidence that most of the people in the first half of the 19th century who were working on screw propellers had much, if any, knowledge that the other people who were doing the work even existed, let alone having any correspondence with them, and yet they all came up with relatively similar ideas. Now, granted, the Archimedes screw existing as a general principle went back thousands of years, but its use in ship propulsion was, lots of different people taking essentially the same idea and turning it into a reality to varying degrees of success. To a limited degree, you could also maybe look at the early generations of modern naval explosives for propellants, in things like cordite, poudre bee, etc., in that they're all essentially based on gun cotton, nitrocellulose, but everybody has kind of arrived at the idea of using nitrocellulose as some kind of base to make a naval explosive without huge amounts of referencing between various organizations, and obviously coming up with slightly different ideas with slightly different degrees of stability, but they've all got this kind of new modern naval explosive thing going on. But it's all convergent rather than everyone agreeing to collaborate, because if they'd agreed to collaborate, they would have invented, one explosive and not 5 or 6 different competing explosives, which, as I said, degraded and spontaneously detonated at varying degrees of reliability. Another good example, actually, is fire control tables, because you can bet as sure as anything, by the time they're being fully developed in the late 1900s and early 1910s, most people are being incredibly secretive about them to stop information getting to the other side in the Anglo-German naval arms race. Now, granted, there is a little bit of correspondence back and forth between nations that are slightly less hostile to each other, like Britain and the US, even if I don't think the security services necessarily knew about that. But fundamentally, the development of the Dreyer and Pollen Argo fire control tables in the UK, the German equivalents, the French equivalents, the American equivalents, etc., mostly took place in a vacuum, isolated from each other, and obviously had slightly different results from each other, but all essentially came to roughly the same conclusion about electromechanical computers to calculate solutions for shells being fired by battlers and battlecruisers. Mikko Leitnen asks, was there ever a thought during the late 18th or early 19th centuries to arm the Marines with rifled muskets or rifles like the Baker to improve accuracy and allow even more effective sniping from the fighting tops? Not as far as I'm aware of, and I think it's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you've got the fact that the Baker rifle, as good as it was in certain land-based applications, was fundamentally a slower to load, slower to fire weapon than the musket. And when you're closing in or have pulled alongside another ship for a boarding action, rate of fire is almost everything at that stage, because in terms of your actual Marines, there are relatively few of them, and with all the gun smoke and the fact that people could be marshalling for a boarding action fairly soon, whether you can put 4 shots downrange in a minute or 2 shots downrange in a minute could make all the difference. And indeed, in a number of accounts, it's noted that sometimes Marines would fire their muskets so quickly that the barrels would get so hot that they couldn't handle them, and they had to switch to another musket while the first one cooled down. That in and of itself gives you some idea of just how urgent the situation was. So that mitigates against the use of a slower loading weapon like a Baker rifle. The other thing is that whilst the Baker rifles were more accurate than muskets, when you look at the land-based accounts of their use, they're talking about using them at 100 yards, 200 yards, something like that, to snipe away at either enemy skirmishers or officers and so forth. But when you're in a boarding action, the ranges you're talking about are considerably less. Even if you're in a fighting top sniping down at the deck, you're not talking about a range in 100 or 200 yards. You're talking about a range where you'd be lucky for it to be 100 feet. I mean, if you look at HMS Victory, for example, and she's a first rate, so considerably taller than most, the total distance from her waterline up to the tip of her masts is around about 200 feet. And of course, the fighting tops aren't all the way up the masts. And if you're firing on the deck, you've got 20, 30 foot of side of a ship building up. So you're going to be engaging at maybe 100 feet or so, which is about 30 to 40 yards. Well, it's 100 feet is just over 33 yards, to be precise. But if you're engaging at between 30 and 40 yards, allowing for the side angle, a musket is accurate enough at that range. If you basically, I would say, if you've got a decent musket and you're a decent shot, if you weren't going to hit a target at that range or much closer, if you're down on the deck and fight and shooting at people who are on the enemy deck, which might be 10-20 yards away, if you're not going to hit with a musket at that point, a rifle is not going to help you in any way, shape or form. Jeffrey Connolly asks, could a triple-gunned turret have been developed during the pre-dreadnought era with the old frying pan-style turrets, or was the technology of the time unable to make it work? And if it could work, what effect would this have had on main battery development? Technically speaking, you could develop a triple turret for a frying pan-style ironclad - very early pre-dreadnought type of battleship. Your two main problems, though, are going to be that the turret diameter is going to have to become larger, as would be the case, obviously, later on with the gunhouse and barbette style that we have on dreadnoughts and most pre-dreadnoughts. But the size increase in and of itself is not beyond the materials technology of the time. It may, however, be well beyond the ships of the time. Because if you look at most ships with triple turrets, starting with something like the Tegethoffs or Dante Alighieri, and going forward to even something like the Iowas, if you compare the barbette diameter with the maximum beam of the ship, it's usually something like 35 to 40% of the beam, and sometimes a little bit less. So you're usually talking at somewhere between 30 and 35 foot barbette diameter, roughly speaking, against a beam that's going to be 90, 100, 104 foot. So obviously, right forward, that beam might be somewhat less, but you get the general idea. You're looking at around about a third, maybe slightly more than a third of beam. And that's with a triple turret. Now, if you look at the ironclads, HMS Devastation at the very beginning with its two twin turrets, something like HMS Victoria, as you can see here, or any of the others with a frying pan style, what you'll notice is that the frying pan style turret for even a 12-inch gun, like on the Devastation, is actually almost the same width as later triple turrets, in part because the guns are physically wider because they're much more heavily built up, and in part because the circular triple turret is, the circular frying pan turret is not necessarily the most efficient way of doing things. So, Devastation's turret is 30 foot, 30 foot in diameter. Devastation herself, however, only has a maximum beam of 62 feet. So her turret width is almost exactly, not quite, but almost exactly half her maximum beam. And, well, you can kind of see the same situation working out with Victoria here. That's a problem, because if you make a triple turret, whether it be in 12-inch or 16.25-inch or whatever, it's now going to be substantially greater in diameter than half of the entire ship's beam. And that's going to impose all sorts of interesting things on balancing it, on stability, and also on the early forms of ammunition supply, how close the edge of your mechanism is to the edge of the ship, which is going to affect how well it's going to stand up to combat, damage, and so on and so forth. So essentially, unless you're prepared to massively downgrade the size of your main guns, maybe go to 9.4-inch the way some of the German pre-dreadnoughts did, you simply aren't going to have enough beam to accommodate a triple turret on most later ironclads and early pre-dreadnoughts. Plus, of course, one of the compromises of the triple turret or the quadruple turret design is that without an awful lot of work, you are fundamentally going to have a slightly slower rate of fire than a twin turret design. You get other efficiencies as well, and you can take mitigation steps, but fundamentally, if everything else is equal, a triple or a quad normally fires slightly slower than a twin, and given the frankly abysmal rates of main battery gunfire in late ironclads and early pre-dreadnoughts, you can't really afford that drop-off. Switch374 asks, I recently found out that when they first began using hydraulics aboard ships in the early 1900s, the fluid was water. Was this pure water, or was it a mix of glycerin and other fluids? What navies used it, and how long did it take them to realise that water wasn't a good fluid for high-pressure hydraulics? And when did they start to shift over to oil? Well, actually, hydraulics go back a bit further than that. The first hydraulic systems in turrets were installed on HMS Thunder in the 1870s. And yes, most early hydraulic systems used water. Rather quickly, they figured out that using water-based hydraulic systems in an environment where the temperature may well drop below freezing was not necessarily such a wise idea. So there were anti-icing additives added. Try saying that 6 times quickly. But fundamentally, they just sort of kept going with it because that's what the system as originally invented had used. There are a number of issues, however, using water as your hydraulic fluid. Obviously, water is actually corrosive, so it will gradually eat into the pipework, etc. Water is also, believe it or not the world's best lubricant compared to oil. And because water has a much lower viscosity than oil does, it actually means, and this is especially important on a lot of the earlier systems, that if a seal or a joint was not 100% perfect with water, you could get actually quite a significant amount of leakage, which combined with its corrosive effects, etc., was not a good thing in any way, shape or form. Whereas oil was just a fraction more forgiving of very, very slight errors. So, broadly speaking, oil and hydraulic fluid, which is usually a mixture of various things, is superior. But that took a little bit of time to kick in, partly because of the issues with water-based hydraulics. A number of nations in the 1890s and early 1900s began to move away from hydraulic systems over to purely electrical systems. The French were the leaders in this field. The US Navy also tried to switch, but some navies found that actually electric technology was not necessarily, at least in their country, advanced quite enough to cope. In the US Navy, for example, during the 1900s, the electrical systems on their turrets were blamed for a number of malfunctions in rough seas, and also for a number of rather nasty turret fires where there'd been, current overloads and so forth. And so for the US Navy, they wanted to switch back to hydraulic systems, but they didn't want to switch back to water-based systems because of all the issues just mentioned. And it seems to be around about this kind of 1900 to 1910 period that oil-based hydraulic systems start to make an appearance in various nations' battleships, including the US Navy's, going forward from sort of mid-19, sort of 1905-ish. And then it kind of develops on from there. Obviously, ships that were built in, let's say, 1890 with water-based hydraulics, if they're still in service in 1905, 1910, for whatever reason, are still going to have those systems. There's no point ripping them out and replacing them. That would be cost prohibitive. But the phasing in of newer oil-based hydraulics for the nations that chose to use hydraulic systems for their turrets kind of happens essentially almost between the introduction of HMS Dreadnought and the beginning of the First World War. Nick Brodar asks, another question from Greyhound. During one of the battles, USS Keeling turns sharply to dodge torpedoes. A, is it possible to dodge torpedoes? And B, the destroyer heels over sharply, nearly putting her rails in the water. Just how far would a destroyer heel during such a turn? I think this is the turn that you're referring to. Now, in answer to your first part question, is it possible to dodge torpedoes? Yes, it is entirely possible to do so. Not at absolute point-blank range, obviously, and not with particularly non-agile vessels. But if you spot a torpedo coming in soon enough, either by spotting its wake or by hydrophone operators hearing it, it's entirely possible for anything up to and including a battleship to turn to avoid incoming torpedoes. Obviously, the more inertia you have and the greater your turning circle, the harder it is to do, how quickly the ship responds to its rudder, etc. But it is entirely possible to dodge torpedoes with enough warning, even if it's maybe only just. Now, as far as when the destroyer heels over, how far would it heel in such a turn? The amount of heeling depends very much on a number of factors. Obviously, if you put the rudder hard over, you're going to heel more because it's a more severe turn. If you're going really fast, you obviously have a lot more inertia, so you're going to heel considerably more. And also the sea state, the current, the wind, for example, as well. If you've got, in this example, if the wind was coming in on the ship's starboard side, that would cause the ship to heel over more, whereas if the wind was coming in on its port side, it would heel slightly less. But what you'll notice here is that although, as you can see, the port side railings are, yes, very much nearly in the water, and that is going to be affected by how high the sea state is as well, you'll see that from vertical, the ship actually hasn't even gone past 45 degrees, and that's because where the upper decks are relative to the overall height of the ship and its center of rotation, these things do make a difference. So for an aircraft carrier, for example, even a small one, for its flight deck to go in any way close to the water, the thing almost has to be on its side, which is a considerably greater problem than for, say, a Fletcher-class destroyer, where its upper deck might be, reaching towards the sea at a point in its heel where it's actually still within relatively safe boundaries. Most ships, at least in theory, have a point of no return in a heel of somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees. Some ships slightly less. You don't really want to be on those. Some ships a little bit more. But I obviously have to emphasize that is the theoretical point of no return. There are instances, somewhat depending on sea state and just pure luck, where ships have gone well beyond that and managed to come back from it. There's even a few photos in things like Typhoon Cobra of that kind of thing happening. But you really, really, really do not want to make a habit of it, because that is, luck and exceptionally good ship design. By all rights, if you go past your point of no return, you will not be coming back. Dave Collier asks, why did John Philip Holland end up designing submarines for the Royal Navy, given his long history with the Irish Nationalist movement and the fact he designed the world's first practical submarine, the Fenian Ram, specifically for attacking the British? Well, I'm not familiar with his personal history in massive amounts of detail, but from a general reading of his history, I would say that whilst he may have had Irish nationalist sympathies, he seems to, and I don't mean this with any prejudice, I just mean this as a statement of fact, he seems to have been more wedded to the idea of getting his submarines actually working and getting paid. And there's also time to consider. So when he built the Fenian Ram for the Irish Republicans, that's about 20 or so years before he actually ends up selling his designs to the Royal Navy. So there's a lot of intervening time there. Plus the fact that, although, yes, he did build the Fenian Ram, he parted company with the Fenians and the Irish Republican Brotherhood on rather bad terms, mostly thanks to the fact that they didn't actually pay him what he was supposed to be paid, and then stole the Fenian Ram and another one of his prototype submarines. Understandably, if you get involved in an organisation that is trying to fight a fight on the other side of an ocean in relatively good faith, and their response is to shortchange you and then steal your work, which you've devoted most of your life to, and he would continue to devote his life to submarines, that might sour your attitude to them just a little bit. Fast forward 20 years, and you've got even larger, even better working submarines. The US Navy's already bought some. And then when the Royal Navy rocks up and says, hey, can we buy the designs? I suspect at that point, given that a Holland-type submarine, with the best will in the world, is not really any sort of use in oppressing the people of Ireland, and the Royal Navy was actually going to pay him, I suspect Holland probably didn't have too many issues handing over the blueprints for that particular design at that stage. Paul Frederick asks, raked funnels on warships. You do not see many, but there are a few, Yamato for example. Was there any performance benefit to having a raked funnel, perhaps better boiler room draft, or aerodynamics, even if that seems to be a bit of a reach? It would seem that the engineering and construction of a raked funnel would be more expensive than a straight one. So was it just designer's ego? There is actually a slight degree of aerodynamics involved. It was discovered, for example, that a kind of a teardrop-shaped funnel, if you're looking down on it from above, would offer somewhat less resistance than a more circular funnel. And raking the funnel kind of helps a little bit with air resistance as well. And I know it sounds a little bit silly, but then look at the size of a funnel, especially a single combined funnel like you have on Yamato. That's actually a significant portion of the air resistance of the ship, and that can actually help with your speed, even if only by a little. Another factor is compared to where the base of the funnel is. Obviously, the funnel throws out a lot of hot gases, smoke, etc. And as time goes on and you have more and more delicate optical equipment and later delicate electronic equipment, etc., mounted on your forward superstructure, especially once the forward superstructure starts to also incorporate the foremast, you don't really want all of that hot exhaust gas coming up and potentially ruining all your equipment. But if your boiler rooms are partially under your forward superstructure and directly aft of it, then you either have to trunk your funnel or funnels really far back, which is going to be annoying and take up a lot of interior volume you could use for other things, or you can have the funnel rise through the deck pretty much in the ideal position directly aft of the bridge, but then by raking the funnel above deck, you direct all of that hot exhaust gas and smoke away from all your sensitive equipment. So, I mean, if you trace down, either look at a full blueprint or even just looking at this photo, if you trace down to where the base of the funnel is on a Yamato class battleship at the upper deck level, and then you straighten that funnel, and then you look at that lovely big optical rangefinder up there, you suddenly realize that if the ship was engaging in a full broadside engagement and that funnel was perfectly vertical, then when the rangefinder turns to port or starboard, one entire arm of it is going to be in a plume of incredibly hot exhaust gases, which is not going to help in any way, shape or form. Whereas this way, again, if you look up and you see those nice big arms of the rangefinder, they can actually rotate full 360 degrees without ever encountering the plume, simply because the funnel is raked. And yes, building a raked funnel is somewhat more of an engineering challenge than building a perfectly vertical funnel. And there are other ways of doing this, for example, with raked funnel caps rather than raking the entire funnel. But it is a perfectly valid way of approaching the problem. Chief Eyeroll asks, it's been recounted that a common tactic of the French Navy before and after the French Revolution was shooting on the uproll to disable spars and other sailing gear. Were there any other tactics at a fleet, squadron or ship level that were notably different than the British Navy? Well, as you may have picked up from Wednesday's Trafalgar video, if you're watching this on the weekend of release, some of the French ships were just flat out better at boarding actions, be they, the various things associated with it, grenades, musket fire, and actual boarding. Unfortunately, for most of the French ships that were so practiced, they tended to run into disadvantages when it came to Royal Navy gunnery. Now, for example, with Redoutable, you could shoot through Redoutable's hull all you liked. There weren't actually that many French sailors left down there after the first 15 minutes, half hour of action, not just because a bunch of them had been killed, but because a lot of them had gathered on the upper deck to try and launch boarding actions. But as it turns out, if you mass people on deck for boarding action, you have to launch it pretty sharpish, otherwise you're going to end up eating several carronades worth of grape shot to the face, which doesn't tend to have particularly good effects on the human condition. So, yeah, that's partly a product of being stuck in port for so long, but all other things being equal in a 1v1 action, at least if the French captain had spent time training his men, you would expect a French crew circa 1805, 1810-ish to perhaps have a slight advantage in a straight-up boarding action compared to the British, who'd have an advantage in gunnery. Another example of differing tactics was where you fought with relation to the wind. So you could hold either the weather gauge or the lee gauge, and the weather gauge was essentially whatever direction the wind was coming from, you were between the wind and the enemy. The lee gauge was the opposite, so the enemy was between you and the wind. And generally speaking, the French tended to prefer to fight in the lee gauge because that meant that they could either fight in the line of battle if they wanted to, or they could withdraw by, turning away and running with the wind. The problem for them with the weather gauge was that you weren't going to turn into the wind and make any significant progress, which meant you had two choices of either maintaining your static lines at whatever separation you were at, or you could sail with the wind to attack the enemy. So you didn't really, if you have had the weather gauge, you didn't really have the option to withdraw. But what you did have was the tactical initiative to decide when and where to attack. The Royal Navy, therefore, tended to prefer engaging from the weather gauge, because as far as they were concerned, they were there to fight people. And this was a tactic sort of developed over the latter part of the 18th century, in part because in other engagements where they'd attacked with the lee gauge, some captains who perhaps were less enthusiastic about supporting the admiral in question had used various excuses to hold back, whereas if you have fighting from the weather gauge, that's somewhat less possible. There were a few disadvantages to fighting from the weather gauge. If you were fighting with the wind coming in from, let's assume that you're sailing with the wind on your starboard side, then your port side is what's facing towards the enemy if you have the weather gauge, and if the wind is particularly strong, your ship's going to heel, which might mean that your lower gun ports are either at risk of being swamped or are actually underwater, so can't be used, whereas obviously the enemy's guns, if they're also rolling in the same direction, they're going to have all their main battery available for use, even if they have to depress it somewhat. So at that point, it's down to the admiral to try and position his ships relative to the wind in such a way that he maintains most of the advantages of the weather gauge without rolling too much, so he can bring his full battery to bear. And so that's a general discrepancy in French and British tactics in the Age of Sail, albeit when I get round to doing a biopic on Hawke, Admiral Hawke, you'll find that he actually, along with a few other Royal Navy admirals, but him in particular, pioneered the idea of actually, whilst there's a preferred gauge to attack from for the Royal Navy, he actually sat down and went, we don't actually care which one we attack from, and a number of his battles involved enveloping the enemy from both sides, because he viewed it as, well, if we have the weather gauge, then yeah, we can attack at will, this is great, and the French have the option of either accepting our attack or running. But he also pointed out that from the way the British approached warfare, fighting from the lee gauge could have its advantages, partly because of the almost guaranteed safety of using your full main battery, but also, as he put it, if the British are fighting in the lee gauge, yeah, it might take a little while for the French to decide to come and fight us, but ultimately they can't escape, because if they turn into the wind, they're becalmed, which is going to end badly for them. If they run with the wind roughly perpendicular, the way they are by default, well, we're in the lee gauge, they're in the weather gauge, we can just have a long-range exchange of gunfire as long as we like. And if they turn to run down the wind towards us, well, they've got to get through us to get away. So in any case, we'll get a fight, regardless of how long it takes it to get to us. PH5817 asks, deck-mounted torpedo tubes. Some of them end like a straight pipe cut, some are angled, and some have a long bill like a baseball cap. What's the purpose of the bill? So the baseball cap bill, as you can see here, the torpedo launcher kind of ends, the actual tube ends just forward of the rotational mechanism, but then you have this long angled thing. This is called, at least in the US Navy, a spoon, and the purpose of the spoon which is retractable so you can fold it back over the launcher for storage reasons, is to help guide the torpedo on its way out. Because obviously the torpedo is launching from essentially a smoothbore launcher, there's no rifling involved. So if the torpedo gets kicked out by gunpowder charge, compressed air charge, whatever it is you happen to be using on your particular launcher, there is a non-zero chance that that torpedo may end up flying through the air at a slight angle, which means when it lands in the water it might motor off in a direction that you don't want it to. So the purpose of the spoon, obviously it has to be open at the bottom because the torpedo is going to be falling away under gravity, but by having this enclosure bit at the top, it guides the torpedo on its initial path out of the launcher and hopefully keeps it nice and straight, or corrects its angle of approach if it is coming out slightly crooked. The more or less confidence you have in the directionality of your launch mechanism, the longer or shorter the spoon that you would have, and also how much the torpedo actually needs to be launched in a dead straight direction can make a lot of difference. So if you look at a lot of the torpedo launchers that were subsequently refitted to destroyers and so forth that either survived World War II or were built shortly after World War II, you'll see these things tend to go away, but that's largely because the post-war torpedoes have guidance systems, so even if they end up launching and hitting the water at a slightly off angle, it doesn't matter quite so much because they're going to autocorrect to home in on the target anyway. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns asks, what were the orders given by the Imperial German Navy to Admiral von Spee? Were they to get home, to raid, to take whatever action he thought necessary, or something else? Spee didn't have any specific direct orders from the Imperial German Navy at the outbreak of war. He did have a very loose set of orders that were sent to him in spring 1914, and they essentially amount to: if the situation is particularly favourable for your cruiser squadron, then attack British holdings and or ships in the East Asia sphere. Otherwise, do as you will. Which was actually a remarkably enlightened set of orders for an admiralty of anybody's description, because it essentially acknowledged that, frankly, at the point that the war broke out, as it looked likely to do, there was basically zero chance of the German Admiralty all the way back in Germany knowing what the exact situation was in the Western Pacific, and therefore them trying to give him specific directions would probably end incredibly badly, whereas von Spee, being the admiral on the scene, would theoretically have a much better idea of what was going on, and therefore would be in a position to best make the call. So essentially, the German Admiralty's position was, well, if it really works, we'd like you to blow up some British stuff, because that's generally the point of being at war with Britain, but otherwise do as you see fit, and that is pretty much what von Spee did. As far as books about the East Asia Squadron and their subsequent voyages, it really depends on whether or not you want books in German or books in English. There are actually a number of pretty decent books in German dedicated to either Admiral von Spee or the East Asia Squadron, whereas books in English, whilst von Spee does appear in, say, a number of World War I Admiral bibliographies or biographies, sort of collected mini-biographies, there isn't so much in English that goes into specific detail about von Spee or the East Asia Squadron. Most of it either is mentioning him or his squadron in passing in a larger context, or there's a number of books which talk about Coronel and the Falklands, which obviously have to set the scene for why the Coronel and the Falklands took place, which will kind of look at basically the World War I career of the East Asia Squadron, with maybe just a little bit of background information to explain why the East Asia Squadron was even there in the first place. So if you're looking for just that, then great. There's quite a few different English sources on that. But if you want to know a lot of the deeper background of the history of the East Asia Squadron generally, such as it is, you basically have to look for more German language sources. So drop me a message or an email and let me know which of the two you're actually looking for more details. Alternate historian Turtle Duck asks, in an older TV show called Turned Washington Spies, There is one episode that takes place prior to the Battle of Yorktown, where one of the spy rings are able to quietly steal a large chunk of the British Navy flag signals books and changes the content so the flag signals in each book are different, and then return them to the Royal Navy none the wiser. For instance, when the Royal Navy is about to enter a naval battle with the French, the British flagship hoists the flag signal turn to port, and the signal books in the other ships of the fleet say vastly different things, such as turn to starboard, anchor in place, do you see torpedo boats, etc., causing confusion amongst the British fleet and leading to them being routed by the French. My question is, how likely is this scenario to actually take place, and if someone did do it, how much confusion would it have caused in a battle? Well, unfortunately for the show, it's exceptionally unlikely to work on quite a few different grounds. Firstly, signal books were quite important and would have been locked away under what passed for extreme security in an age of sail ship of the line. So the statistical odds of somebody being able to gain access to a significant number of the captain's cabins on or for the aft officers' areas of multiple British warships, steal the signal books for long enough to make significant alterations to them in a manner that wouldn't immediately be obvious, and then sneak aboard all the said ships to return them all it's essentially non-existent. It's not going to happen. But even if such a scheme was hatched and attempted, specifically for the American War of Independence, it's still not going to work, because the detailed flag signals books, such as were used at Trafalgar, don't exist at the time of the American War of Independence. The Admiralty, the first formal, fleet-wide Admiralty signals books weren't introduced until 1799, and Popham's reforms that allow for signals like "England expects every man will do his duty" to be hoisted didn't come in until slightly after that. So 20 plus years earlier, there is no such uniform signal book. There are individual admirals' ideas of signal books, and there are some basic numerical flag signals, but even if in this scenario at this time, in the 1770s, that you've managed to somehow replace everything, the fact there are so few signals actually works against the premise, because with those few signals, you could actually memorize them. And certainly the very common ones like turning to port, etc., any decent signals officer would have been able to memorize the 40 or 50 so instructions that could be delivered by the numerical signals that are available at the time, at which point, if the flagship hoists turn to port, which would be a relatively common signal, the flag officers, or the signals officers on the various ships, they're just going to know what that means. They're not going to have to bother to consult the book, and they will know their books well enough because of these various, memorized signals, that when they look at them and they're like, that's not right. Something's not right about this book. So, weirdly enough, if someone had pulled off the near impossible to pull off feat of messing with everybody's signals books at, say, Trafalgar or any of the major battles that post-date Trafalgar, it has a much higher chance of succeeding, because the huge number of signals that could be made would therefore need decoding via book. But back in the American War of Independence, there just aren't that many signals to mess with. And finally, for this half, Sergeant Schultz asks, I was reading about HMS Warspite and specifically how she was refitted on the US West Coast in late 1941 following actions in the Mediterranean. The section about this says that her worn 15-inch guns were replaced and various other upgrades made. My main question is, how did the US shipyards obtain or have 15-inch 42 barrels or liners? And as an aside, what other modifications and additions were made during this refit? Yep, she was refitted in Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Here she is, in said shipyard, with a pair of accommodation hulks alongside her, and her 15-inch guns were indeed replaced by 15-inch guns that were shipped across from the UK. By boat, obviously. I couldn't find any specific reference as to whether these guns were shipped to a US East Coast port and then transported across the continental United States, or whether the guns were transported by ship to the US East Coast, then down round through the Caribbean and back up the US West Coast. But either one would potentially be viable, and since Japan was not yet in the war, it would have been a relatively peaceful and safe transition once you got past a certain point beyond the range of German U-boats. Now, as far as the other modifications and additions are concerned, there is actually a list, so I shall read unto thee the list of modifications made at Puget Sound, apart from obviously redoing the main battery. Armament, 450 caliber machine guns were, machine gun mountings, I should say, were removed, and 11 single 20mm Oerlikons were fitted. Type 281 radar was fitted with a transmitting office on the starboard side aft number 2 bridge platform, and a receiving office was installed in the aft superstructure. Aerials were fitted on the fore and mainmast heads. Type 284 office, so the office for Type 284 radar, was fitted in the high-frequency direction finder office on the signalling platform, and the aerials were on the main direct control tower. Type 271 radar was fitted with an aerial on the foremast starfish. Type 285 radar, 2 sets, were fitted with offices at the rear of the Admiral's bridge, port and starboard, and the aerials fitted on the HACS directors, high-angle control system. And Type 282 radar was fitted with 4 sets fitted on the pom-pom directors. Type FM2 medium-frequency direction finding equipment was fitted with an office at number 2 bridge platform and a fixed-frame aerial on the front of the compass platform. There were also bridge modifications. The signal platform was extended aft by 7 feet, the Admiral's bridge was increased in width, and the forward end was enclosed and fitted with windows. Surface lookout huts were fitted abreast the funnels, presumably to keep them nice and dry, and steel screens were fitted on the outboard edges of the forecastle deck, abreast the 4-inch gun twin mountings. And that concludes the first half of the Patreon Drydock. On to part 2.